The silver dollar felt unnaturally heavy in Porterbarrow's palm as dawn painted the sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold. The coin was worn smooth at the edges, the date barely visible. 1891, nearly as old as the wild desperation in Cyrus Yarrow's eyes. Porter studied the man on his porch. Cyrus, once the most successful rancher in 3 counties, now reduced to trembling hands and darting glances over his shoulder at shadows that weren't there. Porter had opened his door to find a ghost of the man he'd seen around town. Cyrus's clothes hung loosely on his frame, his face gaunt beneath a week's growth of beard. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, which kept drifting toward the horizon, as if expecting riders to materialize from the morning mist. When he spoke, his voice cracked like parched earth. "Take it, just take it. $1, that's all I'm asking." Porter examined the deed Cyrus had thrust toward him. 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in Clearwater County, timber rights, mineral rights, water access, properties men had killed for throughout the West's bloody history, offered for the price of a loaf of bread. His fingers traced the official seals and signatures. The document was legitimate, but that only deepened the mystery. "What's the catch?" Yarrow Cyrus was already backing down the porch steps, shaking his head violently, eyes wild with an emotion Porter couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, but something deeper, more primordial. "No questions. Just don't dig too deep into the past. Some things should stay buried." The word buried sent an odd chill through Porter, despite the warm morning air. Before he could respond, Cyrus pressed the deed and silver dollar into his hands with the finality of a man completing a transaction that had been haunting him for too long. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning mist like a specter fleeing sunrise. Porter watched until the last wisps of fog swallowed Cyrus's retreating figure, then closed his door and spread the deed across his kitchen table. 3,000 acres. Rich soil, good water, all for a silver dollar that looked older than the state itself. He turned the coin between his fingers, studying the worn face of liberty on one side, the proud eagle on the reverse. Something was very wrong with this situation, but Porterbarrow had never been a man to turn away from trouble, a trait that had cost him nearly everything once before. 3 months later, Porter leaned on the worn handle of his shovel and surveyed the work he'd done on the north pasture. The land responded well to his careful attention, as if it had been waiting for someone who understood its rhythms. The spring rains had greened up the valley, and the 50 head of cattle he'd purchased with his modest savings were growing fat on the rich grass. From the top of this gentle rise, he could see the entire ranch spreading before him, rolling pasture land bordered by stands of pine and oak, a creek cutting a silver line through the property, and in the distance the sharp rise of the eastern ridge, its limestone face catching the afternoon sun. His cabin sat nestled against a protective hillside, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd left a stew simmering. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a covered porch, but it was more home than he'd known since leaving the military. 3 months of hard physical labor had begun to erase some of the shadows that had followed him from his last deployment. Here the only orders he followed were the ones he gave himself, and the only judgment came from the land itself, which was brutally honest but never political. Porter wiped sweat from his brow and thought back to his final days in uniform. 15 years of distinguished service ended with a whispered conversation in a sterile Pentagon corridor. The evidence he'd gathered of corruption in his unit had been damning. Supply contracts, diverted protection, money collected from local villages, all under the command of a colonel whose family connections reached into the highest levels of government. Porter had done everything by the book, followed every protocol for reporting up the chain of command. For his loyalty to the oath he'd sworn, he'd been quietly pushed into early retirement with an honorable discharge that tasted like ash in his mouth. The seductive whispers of what he could have done differently still visited him in the small hours of night. He could have looked the other way like everyone else. He could have taken his cut of the money. He could have kept his career, his pension, his purpose. But the man staring back at him in the mirror each morning wouldn't have been someone he recognized. Porter's reverie was broken by the sound of his plow striking something solid beneath the soil. The dull thud was different from the occasional rocks that peppered the north field. He knelt and brushed away the loose earth, revealing a corner of something wooden and decayed. Curiosity piqued, he began to dig more carefully around the object, expanding the hole until the outline of a small chest emerged from the dark soil. The wood was rotted but still intact, bound with rusted iron bands. What caught Porter's attention were the symbols carved into its surface, elaborate designs that had somehow survived decades, perhaps centuries, beneath the earth. They weren't like anything he recognized, not Native American nor Spanish colonial. They looked almost like an elaborate cipher, a coded message meant to be understood only by those who knew the key. As Porter carefully excavated around the chest, his shovel struck something that produced a hollow, brittle sound. He brushed away more soil, revealing what was unmistakably a human skull. His stomach tightened as he continued to clear the area, exposing more bones. A complete skeleton, the remains still articulated in a way that suggested the body had been deliberately buried, rather than scattered by animals or the elements. The skeleton lay with arms crossed over its chest, the posture of a formal burial. But what made Porter's blood run cold was what he found clutched in the skeletal fingers, a letter sealed but perfectly preserved, protected from the elements by some kind of waxed paper covering. The parchment was yellowed with age, but the writing on its face was still legible, L. Mercer, in an elegant, flowing script. L. Mercer. The name struck a chord in Porter's memory. Lydia Mercer, the quiet, thoughtful woman who worked at Clearwater's general store. He'd spoken with her half a dozen times since arriving in town, each conversation leaving him more intrigued by her sharp mind and the careful reserve that seemed to mask deeper currents. Could there be a connection, or was it merely coincidence? Porter's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the letter. The wax seal was intact, a simple design that might have been a stylized M. As his fingers closed around the parchment, the distant sound of approaching horses reached his ears. Quickly, he slipped the letter inside his vest pocket, then began kicking soil back over the exposed bones and chest. Something told him this discovery needed to remain secret until he understood what he was dealing with. By the time the rider came into view, Porter had covered most of the evidence and was casually leaning on his shovel. Through the heat shimmer rising from the prairie, he recognized the weathered face of Sheriff Thomas Bradford Coleman, his silver star catching the afternoon sun. Coleman was a big man carrying his 50-plus years with the solid confidence of someone used to authority. He came from one of the founding families of Clearwater County, a fact he managed to work into most conversations. The sheriff dismounted near Porter's excavation site, his eyes scanning the freshly disturbed earth with suspicious intensity. His right hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered revolver, not a threat but a reminder of its presence. "Afternoon, Barrow. Thought I'd ride out and check on our newest landowner. Getting settled in, all right?" Porter forced his voice to remain even casual. "Just fine, Sheriff. Working on clearing some rocks for better grazing." "Nothing worth mentioning." Coleman's eyes lingered on the dark stains in the soil, stains that looked suspiciously like they might have come from something organic that had spent a long time underground. He stepped closer, the leather of his gun belt creaking softly. "Funny thing about this land. Previous owners seem to have accidents. Maybe you should be more careful about what you dig up out here." The threat in Coleman's voice was unmistakable. Porter felt the letter burning against his chest like a brand, but kept his expression neutral. Around them, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of old earth and older secrets. "Accidents?" Porter asked, trying to sound casual. "What kind of accidents?" Coleman's smile was cold as winter steel. "The permanent kind. This land has a way of keeping its secrets buried, Barrow. Smart men don't ask too many questions about what happened before they got here." Porter matched the sheriff's gaze. "Maybe I'm not that smart. For your sake, I hope that's not true." Coleman surveyed the property with a proprietary air that made Porter's jaw tighten. "You paid Cyrus Yarrow a fair price for this place." The question felt like a trap. "Fair enough. Times have been hard for a lot of ranchers." Coleman nodded slowly, his eyes giving nothing away. "Cyrus always was an odd duck. Hasn't been seen around town lately. You happen to know where he went after selling to you?" "Said something about heading to his sister's place in Oregon." Porter kept his face impassive, though he had no idea if Cyrus even had a sister. "Oregon." Coleman repeated the word as if testing its truth. "Well, if you see him around, you let me know. We have some unfinished business." With that, the sheriff mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Porter standing in the field with more questions than answers. He waited until Coleman was well beyond the property line before returning to the gravesite. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the pasture. Porter carefully re-excavated the chest and bones, documenting everything with his camera phone. The positioning of the skeleton, the unusual symbols on the chest, the location relative to landmarks on the property. If this was evidence of something sinister, he wanted a record that couldn't be easily destroyed. Then, with silent apology to the unknown deceased, he reburied the remains more carefully, marking the spot in his mind while ensuring it would look undisturbed to casual observation. The letter remained in his pocket, a tangible weight far heavier than its physical presence would suggest. Porter finished his fieldwork as dusk gathered, his mind churning with questions. Who was buried in his north pasture? How long had the body been there? What connection might exist between this L. Mercer and Lydia from the general store? And most importantly, why had Sheriff Coleman seemed so interested in what Porter might dig up? Back in his cabin, Porter locked the door, something he rarely bothered with out here, and spread the letter on his kitchen table. The cabin was warm from the wood stove, the air rich with the aroma of the venison stew he'd prepared that morning. Outside, night creatures began their choruses as darkness claimed the land. In this moment of solitude, he finally allowed himself to break the seal on the mysterious letter. The wax cracked like old bones as he pressed his thumb against it. Inside, the handwriting was elegant but faded, each word written with the careful precision of someone who knew their message might be the last thing they ever wrote. My dearest Lydia, it began, the formal cadence of another era flowing across the page. If you are reading this, then the truth I feared to speak has finally surfaced. What they did to your grandfather was not justice. It was murder disguised as law. Porter's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just old history. It was an accusation that echoed across time. He continued reading, each line more disturbing than the last. The gold they claimed he stole was never stolen. It was payment. Blood money for services rendered to men who now sit in positions of great power. They buried him in unmarked ground to silence him forever. But I have kept proof of their crime. Look for the oak tree split by lightning on the eastern ridge. Beneath its roots lies evidence that will restore your family's honor and destroy those who took it. The letter was signed simply M, with a date that made Porter's stomach drop, exactly 200 years ago to the day. He looked again at the photograph he'd taken of the skeletal remains. Someone had been murdered and buried on his property, their body hidden along with this damning letter that had never reached its intended recipient. But who was M, and why had they risked everything to preserve this message for a woman named Lydia Mercer? Porter's mind raced to the woman he'd met in town. Could this possibly be connected to her? The coincidence seemed too great, yet the alternative, that there were two L. Mercers connected to this land across 2 centuries, seemed equally implausible. Porter pulled out his laptop and connected to the satellite internet he'd installed his first week on the ranch. He began researching the history of Clearwater County, focusing on the early 1800s when the letter had been written. The official county history was oddly sparse for that period, mentioning frontier settlements and the establishment of the territorial government, but few specific events or people. He deepened his search, finding references to the founding families, names that still dominated local politics and business. The Colemans, Harrisons, Wickhams, and Bradfords had all arrived as part of the first wave of settlement. Thomas Bradford Coleman, the current sheriff, was the direct descendant of both the Bradford and Coleman lines, the families having intermarried several generations back. What Porter couldn't find was any significant mention of the Mercer family, despite the letter suggesting they had been present during the same period. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record, their existence reduced to a footnote in someone else's story. As midnight approached, Porter found a brief mention in an archived newspaper from 1825. Local man J. Mercer hanged for theft of territorial gold shipment. The article was frustratingly brief, mentioning neither first name nor specific details of the alleged crime. But it was enough to confirm that the letter wasn't merely fiction. There had been a Mercer accused of stealing gold, and he had indeed been executed for the crime. Porter rubbed his tired eyes and closed the laptop. Tomorrow he would need to speak with Lydia Mercer. If she was connected to this history, she deserved to know what he had discovered. But first he would visit the eastern ridge and find the lightning-split oak mentioned in the letter. If evidence had survived 2 centuries beneath its roots, it might provide the context he needed to understand what had happened on this land. Sleep came fitfully that night, Porter's dreams filled with skeletal hands reaching from the earth and Sheriff Coleman's cold smile as he buried something that continued to scream even after the last shovelful of dirt fell. Morning found Porter hiking along the eastern ridge, following the limestone escarpment that formed the property's natural boundary. The terrain was rough here, the soil thin over bedrock, supporting hardy junipers and scattered oaks that had found purchase in crevices. He had studied the property maps carefully before setting out, but they showed dozens of oak trees along the ridge. Finding one split by lightning might prove challenging after 2 centuries of growth and change. An hour into his search, Porter rounded a bend in the ridge and stopped short. Before him stood an ancient oak, its massive trunk being nearly split in two by some long-ago lightning strike. The wound had partially healed the tree, adapting to its injury by growing around the damage, but the evidence of that violent moment remained in its divided trunk and the blackened scar that ran from canopy to roots. This had to be the tree mentioned in the letter. It stood apart from its neighbors both in size and in the dramatic nature of its injury. Porter approached, carefully studying the ground around its gnarled roots. 2 centuries of fallen leaves and erosion would have changed the landscape significantly, but the letter had specifically mentioned beneath its roots, a location that might have remained relatively stable through the years. He set down his backpack and removed a collapsible shovel. If Coleman or his deputies happened to spot him, he could claim to be taking soil samples or hunting for arrowheads, innocent explanations that might not raise immediate suspicion. But Porter's instincts told him to work quickly and to disturb as little as possible. The soil around the massive roots was rocky and resistant, but Porter's methodical approach soon revealed a small hollow beneath one of the largest roots. His shovel struck something solid, producing a muted metallic sound. Heart racing, he switched to using his hands, carefully removing soil until he exposed the corner of what appeared to be a metal box. The container was smaller than the chest he'd found earlier, but clearly from the same era. It had been sealed with some kind of resin or wax that had protected it from moisture and decay. Porter worked it free from its earthen cradle and brushed away the clinging soil. There were no symbolic carvings on this box, just a simple latch that had been secured with a now rusted padlock. Porter broke the fragile lock with a sharp tap from a rock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were documents that made his pulse quicken. Land deeds, signed confessions, and detailed records of what appeared to be a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of the territorial government. Names jumped out at him: Judge Harrison, Marshal Wickham, Land Commissioner Bradford, the ancestors of families that still controlled much of Clearwater County. One document in particular caught his attention, a sworn affidavit signed by Jonathan Mercer, dated 3 days before his execution. In it, Mercer detailed how he had discovered an exceptionally rich gold deposit on land that was technically part of the public domain. Before he could file an official claim, he was approached by representatives of the territorial governor, who offered him a deal: a significant payment in exchange for information about the deposit's location and his silence regarding who truly controlled the mine. Mercer had accepted the payment only to be arrested days later for stealing the very gold that had been given to him as payment. The affidavit named his accusers, the same men who had made the deal with him, and described how they had used his execution as a way to both silence him and discredit any claims his family might make to the gold-rich land. Porter carefully photographed each document before returning them to their protective coverings. This was evidence of a historical injustice, but Sheriff Coleman's warnings suggested the past might not be as distant as it appeared. The founding families still controlled Clearwater County. If their wealth and power had been built on murder and theft, what might they do to protect that legacy? The afternoon sun was beginning its westward slide when Porter returned to his cabin. He secured the metal box and its contents beneath a loose floorboard, then downloaded the photographs to both his laptop and an encrypted cloud storage account. If anything happened to him or the physical evidence, there would still be a record beyond the reach of local authorities. It was time to visit Lydia Mercer. The general store would be closing soon, but he might still catch her before she left for the day. Porter cleaned up, changed into fresh clothes, and drove his truck into Clearwater, the small town that served as the county seat. Clearwater had the preserved in amber quality of many rural American towns. A main street lined with century-old brick buildings, a courthouse square with a Civil War memorial, and the gradual encroachment of chain stores at its edges. The general store occupied a corner building of red brick, its large display windows showcasing an eclectic mix of practical necessities and local crafts. A bell chimed softly as Porter entered. Lydia looked up from behind the counter where she had been tallying the day's receipts. Recognition sparked in her green eyes, followed by something Porter couldn't quite read. Caution, perhaps, or a deeper wariness. She was in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her movements efficient as she organized inventory with methodical precision. "Porter, I wasn't expecting to see you today. How's the ranch treating you?" "It's full of surprises." Porter kept his voice casual, moving to the counter as the last customer left the store. "I keep learning new things about its history." The color drained from Lydia's face. Her hands, which had been steady while handling merchandise, began to tremble slightly. History can be complicated around here. Some stories are better left alone. Porter stepped closer, lowering his voice. What if someone found proof that an innocent man was murdered, that his death was covered up by powerful people who are still alive today? Lydia's breathing became shallow and rapid. She glanced toward the windows, then moved quickly to lock the front door and flipped the sign to closed. When she turned back to face him, tears were gathering in her eyes. "My great-great-grandfather was hanged for stealing gold he never took. My family has lived with that shame for generations. We've been outcasts, treated like criminals because of lies told by men who wanted to protect themselves." Porter's heart hammered against his ribs. "Lydia, what if I told you I found evidence that could clear his name?" Her eyes widened with desperate hope, but before she could respond, a shadow moved past the storefront window. Someone had been listening to their conversation. Porter caught a glimpse of expensive boots and fine clothing, not the gear of a common ranch hand. Lydia saw it too, and her face went pale with terror. "They know, dear God, they know we're talking about it." Porter grabbed Lydia's hand without hesitation. "We need to leave now." She nodded quickly, gathering her purse and a worn leather-bound journal from beneath the counter. They slipped out through the store's back entrance as heavy footsteps approached the front door. In the alley behind the store, Porter could see several men surrounding the building, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. These weren't common thieves. They moved with military precision, like men accustomed to making problems disappear quietly. "Where can we go?" Lydia whispered as they crept toward the alley where Porter had parked his truck. "My ranch. There's something buried there we need to find before they do." They reached the truck without being spotted and drove casually out of town, taking the main road before turning onto a series of increasingly obscure back roads. Porter watched the rearview mirror, alert for signs of pursuit. The setting sun stretched their shadows across the dusty road ahead. After several miles of silence, Lydia spoke, her voice steadier now that immediate danger had passed. "How did you find it?" The evidence Porter told her about discovering the skeleton and the letter, watching her reaction carefully. As he described the chest with its strange symbols, Lydia opened her journal and flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for: a hand-drawn copy of symbols identical to those Porter had found. "My grandmother drew these. She said they were a family code, a way for Mercers to leave messages only other family members could understand. She taught them to me when I was a child, but I never imagined they were real. I thought it was just a story to make me feel special when the other children wouldn't play with me because of my name." Porter steered the truck onto the rutted road leading to his ranch. "Can you read them, the symbols?" Lydia nodded her finger, tracing the patterns in her journal. "It's a simple substitution cipher. Each symbol stands for a letter or common word. This one here," she pointed to a mark resembling an arrow piercing a circle, "means truth. And this, a horizontal line crossed by 3 vertical slashes, means buried. Buried truth." That's what was carved on the chest. As the ranch came into view, Porter felt a new weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had stumbled onto something that had been hidden for generations, something people had died to protect or expose. And now he had involved Lydia, whose family had already paid a terrible price for being connected to this secret. They parked behind the cabin, out of sight from the main road. Inside, Porter secured the doors and windows, while Lydia examined the documents he had recovered from beneath the oak tree. Her fingers trembled as she read her ancestor's affidavit. "This is him, Jonathan Emmett Mercer. My family's oral history got so much right, that he was innocent, that he was framed, but we never knew why. We thought it was just petty corruption, not this." Porter joined her at the table, spreading out the other documents he had discovered. This goes beyond one man being framed. Look at these land records. After your great-great-grandfather was executed, his claim and dozens of others were redistributed to the founding families. Judge Harrison Marshall Wickham, Land Commissioner Bradford. They divided the gold-rich properties among themselves. Lydia's eyes widened as she studied a territorial map with property boundaries carefully drawn in different colors. These are the largest ranches in the county today. The Wickham Estate, Harrison Enterprises, the Bradford Trust. They all started with these stolen claims. But this is what truly disturbs me. Porter pointed to a ledger page dated 1820. The gold your ancestor discovered wasn't just a random deposit. According to these notes, it was part of a massive vein that runs throughout the eastern region of the county. They didn't just steal one claim. They systematically eliminated anyone who discovered valuable deposits, then claimed the land through legal manipulation. Dear God, Lydia's voice was barely a whisper. They built the entire county economy on murder, and I don't think they ever stopped. Porter hesitated, then told her about Sheriff Coleman's warning and strange behavior. His suspicion that the corruption detailed in these historical documents might have continued into the present day. The Harrisons still control the largest bank in 3 counties. The Wickhams have produced sheriffs and judges for generations. And Bradford, Porter's voice trailed off as recognition hit him. What is it? Lydia asked, her eyes dark with concern. Bradford, that's Sheriff Coleman's middle name. Thomas Bradford Coleman. I've seen it on official documents. He's a direct descendant of both families. Porter looked up at her with dawning horror. We're not just fighting the descendants of these criminals. We're fighting the same families who have been covering this up for 200 years. Lydia's face hardened with resolve. Then we need more than just these historical documents. We need to prove they're still operating the same way today. Porter nodded slowly. And I think I know where we might find that proof. The letter mentioned evidence that would restore your family's honor and destroy those who took it. But it also referenced something else, a burial in unmarked ground. I found one body, but what if there are more? What if all their victims are buried somewhere on this property? Lydia opened her journal again, flipping to a hand-drawn map that closely resembled the territory shown in the historical documents. According to family stories, there's a cave system beneath the eastern ridge. The entrance is supposed to be hidden behind the waterfall at Devil's Creek. If they were hiding something important, something that could expose them, that would be the perfect place. The sound of vehicles approaching from the main road cut their conversation short. Porter moved to the window, carefully peering through the curtains. 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs were turning onto his property headlights, cutting through the gathering darkness. They're here. Porter moved quickly, gathering the documents in Lydia's journal. Is there another way to Devil's Creek without taking the main ranch road? Lydia studied the property map on the wall. If we cut through the north pasture and follow the tree line along the ridge, we could reach it from above. It's rough country, but it would keep us out of sight. Porter grabbed a backpack and filled it with essentials. Water, a first aid kit, flashlights, his camera, and a hunting knife. He hesitated, then added his service pistol and spare ammunition. He hadn't fired the weapon since leaving the military, but the determined approach of Coleman's men suggested this situation might escalate beyond civil conversation. They slipped out the back door as vehicle doors slammed in the front yard. Keeping low, they used the darkness and the cabin's shadow to conceal their movement toward the tree line beyond the north pasture. Behind them, Porter could hear Coleman's authoritative voice issuing commands to his deputies. Split up. Check the outbuildings first, then the main house. Remember, we're just having a friendly conversation with our new neighbor. No need to spook him, yet. Porter and Lydia reached the trees without being spotted, the darkness swallowing them as they moved deeper into the woodland that bordered the eastern ridge. The quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate without flashlights, which might have betrayed their position. The night was alive with sounds. Insects, night birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. A symphony that might mask their movement, but also made it impossible to hear if they were being pursued. As they pushed deeper into the property, Lydia's knowledge of local geography proved invaluable. She identified landmarks barely visible in the dim light, keeping them oriented toward Devil's Creek and away from open areas where they might be spotted. Her family had lived in the region for generations, their connection to the land passing from parent to child, even as their name was systematically erased from official histories. They paused at the top of a steep incline, catching their breath, while surveying the terrain ahead. In the distance, Porter could make out the silver ribbon of Devil's Creek as it wound through the valley before disappearing into a narrow canyon that cut through the eastern ridge. My grandmother used to tell stories about that canyon. Lydia's voice was soft in the darkness. She said it was a sacred place that our ancestors had hidden something precious there. I always thought she meant something spiritual, but now, Porter squeezed her hand reassuringly. Then let's find out what they were protecting. They began their descent toward the canyon, the ground becoming increasingly rocky and treacherous. Behind them, Porter caught the distant flash of flashlight beams sweeping through the trees. Coleman's men had expanded their search beyond the cabin and outbuildings. It was only a matter of time before they picked up their trail. Halfway down the slope, the distinct crack of a branch breaking nearby froze them in place. Porter held his breath, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart. 20 feet to their left, a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of a pine grove. A deputy moving parallel to their path, sweeping his flashlight in deliberate arcs across the forest floor. Porter pulled Lydia down behind a fallen log, his hand covering her mouth to stifle any sound. They lay perfectly still as the beam of light passed within inches of their hiding place, illuminating the disturbed pine needles where they had just been standing. The deputy paused, his light lingering on the sign of passage. For a moment, Porter was certain they had been discovered. His hand moved slowly toward his pistol, though he had no desire to use it against a man who might simply be following orders. The deputy's radio crackled to life, Coleman's voice unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Jensen, report. Any sign of them on the north slope?" The deputy keyed his radio. "Possible trail, but it's hard to tell from animal sign in this light. Continuing sweep toward the creek. Try to head them off if they're making for the canyon. We need to have a chat with Barrow before he does something stupid that gets him and the Mercer woman hurt." The deliberate emphasis Coleman placed on hurt sent a chill through Porter. This wasn't a friendly neighborhood check-in. The sheriff knew exactly what they had discovered and was determined to contain the situation, permanently if necessary. The deputy moved on his flashlight beam, disappearing among the trees as he continued toward the creek. Porter and Lydia remained motionless until they were certain he was well away from their position, then resumed their careful descent by a slightly altered route. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached the canyon, the creek swollen by recent spring rains. Devil's Creek carved a deep channel between steep banks too swift to cross safely in the dark. But there was another route, a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall, hidden from view below, but exposed to anyone looking down from above. "Can you make that climb?" Porter asked, indicating the treacherous path. Lydia studied the ledge and nodded grimly. "Better than I can dodge bullets." They made their way along the ledge backs pressed against cold stone fingers, searching for handholds in the darkness. Below them, the creek rushed over rocks with enough noise to mask their movements, but one slip would mean a fatal fall. Halfway across, Porter heard Coleman's voice again, closer than before. "They're heading for the waterfall. Johnson, take 3 men and circle around. I want them cornered when they reach the cave entrance." Porter's blood ran cold. Coleman knew about the tunnel. This wasn't just about protecting old secrets. It was a trap. They were being herded directly into the place where Coleman wanted them to go. But it was too late to turn back. Behind them lay certain capture. Ahead lay uncertain danger. As they reached the waterfall, the sound of rushing water became thunderous. The cascade dropped nearly 30 feet from the ridge above, creating a curtain of silver in the moonlight. Behind it, barely visible, was a dark opening in the canyon wall, the entrance to the cave system Lydia's grandmother had described. "They're going to be waiting for us on the other side." Porter had to raise his voice to be heard over the roar of the falls. Lydia pointed to a narrow gap between the water and the cave entrance, a precarious path that required pressing against the slick stone wall while the outer edge of the falls pounded down inches away. "Maybe not. There's a second passage my grandmother mentioned. It branches off near the entrance, but isn't obvious unless you know what to look for." Porter nodded, trusting her knowledge. They edged along the narrow shelf, the spray soaking them as they slipped behind the thundering curtain of water. The temperature dropped noticeably inside the cave, the air heavy with moisture and the metallic scent of wet stone. Porter activated his flashlight, keeping the beam low to minimize the chance of it being spotted from outside. The cave entrance was a natural formation, water carved over millennia, but as they moved deeper, Porter could see signs of human modification. Chisel marks on the walls, the floor roughly leveled in places. Lydia led them about 30 feet and then stopped at what appeared to be a solid wall. It's here. Her fingers traced the rock face until she found a barely perceptible seam. Help me push. Right here. Porter added his strength to hers, pressing against the section of wall she had indicated. For a moment, nothing happened then. With a grating sound of stone against stone, a section of the wall pivoted inward, revealing a narrow passage beyond. They squeezed through the opening, then carefully closed the hidden door behind them. This new tunnel was different, clearly hand-carved with tools rather than naturally formed, the ceiling lower, forcing Porter to duck his head in places. Their flashlight beams revealed ancient tool marks in the stone walls, evidence of desperate men working in darknesses to hide something precious enough to kill for. The passage descended at a gentle angle, taking them deeper beneath the eastern ridge. After several hundred feet, it opened into a larger chamber, and Porter's flashlight beam revealed something that made them both gasp. Along the walls, stacked in neat piles, were canvas sacks marked with territorial government seals, dozens of them untouched for nearly 2 centuries. But it wasn't the gold that made Porter's heart race. It was what lay scattered around the sacks. Skeletons. Many skeletons. Men who had been brought here and murdered, their bodies left to rot alongside the treasure they had died protecting. Dear God, Lydia's voice echoed in the chamber. They didn't just steal the gold. They brought the prospectors here and executed them. Porter examined the remains more closely, his flashlight revealing personal effects that told stories of lives cut short, wedding rings, pocket watches, letters from home, all belonging to men who had simply been in the wrong place with the wrong knowledge. But it was a leather satchel tucked beneath one of the skeletons that contained the most devastating discovery. Inside were additional documents, including a detailed ledger that recorded not just the historical crimes, but ongoing operations that stretched into the present day. Lydia, look at this. Porter's voice was tight with shock. These aren't just records from 200 years ago. Some of these entries are recent, within the last 5 years. The ledger revealed a criminal enterprise that had never stopped operating. Land fraud, murder, theft, all documented with bureaucratic precision, as if the passage of centuries had only refined their methods rather than eliminated them. Properties acquired through suspicious foreclosures, development rights secured through zoning variances, competitors who experienced convenient accidents or sudden health crises. But the final entry made Porter's blood freeze. Transaction complete. Barrow Ranch purchase. Subject eliminated per standard protocol. Property secured for excavation. Porter looked up at Lydia with dawning horror. They planned this from the beginning. Cyrus didn't sell me the ranch because he was desperate. He sold it because he was ordered to. I was supposed to find the evidence and then disappear, just like everyone else who got too close to the truth. The sound of boots splashing through the main cave entrance cut off Lydia's response. Coleman's voice echoed off the stone walls, confident and mocking. End of the line, Barrow. You've served your purpose. Time to join the other unfortunate souls who couldn't leave well enough alone. Porter extinguished his flashlight, plunging them into absolute darkness. But as Coleman's men entered the chamber with their own lights, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. This wasn't just about protecting old crimes. It was about covering up new ones that were still being committed. And he and Lydia had walked directly into the place where witnesses came to die. Sheriff Coleman stepped into the chamber with 4 armed men, their lanterns casting grotesque shadows across the walls of bones and gold. His weathered face wore the calm expression of a man who had orchestrated dozens of similar executions. The badge on his chest caught the light as he moved forward, a symbol of authority perverted into a tool of oppression. Impressive, isn't it? Coleman gestured at the stacks of gold and the grim tableau of skeletons surrounding them. 2 centuries of efficient problem-solving. Every man who found this place thought he was the first, just like you did, Barrow. Porter kept his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. You made one mistake, Coleman. You assumed I was as naive as the others. Coleman laughed, the sound echoing unnaturally in the underground chamber. Really? And what mistake was that? I never came here alone. The sheriff's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. You're bluffing. Am I? Porter pulled a folded paper from his vest. Not one of the historical documents, but something he had written himself while Lydia was studying the ledger. Before we left the ranch, I made copies of everything we found. Every document, every name in that ledger, every detail of your operation. Those copies are already on their way to the territorial governor's office, along with a full confession detailing how you lured me here to die. You're lying, Coleman snarled, but sweat had appeared on his forehead. Porter pressed his advantage. The courier left at midnight with instructions to deliver everything directly to Governor Williams if I didn't return by dawn. That gives you about 3 hours before the entire territorial government learns exactly what you've been doing here. Lydia caught on immediately. Judge Harrison, Marshal Wickham, Land Commissioner Bradford. They're all named in those documents. Even if you kill us, you can't kill the evidence that's already in official hands. One of Coleman's men shifted nervously. Boss, if he's telling the truth, he's not. Coleman snapped. It's a desperate bluff from a dead man. But Porter could see the doubt growing in the sheriff's eyes. The beauty of his lie was that Coleman couldn't verify it without leaving the chamber, and every minute of delay made the story more believable. There's something else you don't know, Porter continued. Cyrus Yarrow didn't disappear after selling me the ranch. He's been hiding at my place for 3 months, documenting everything he was ordered to do. He knows about the murder orders, the fake land sales, all of it. If I don't come back, he's going to the federal marshals. This wasn't entirely true. Porter suspected Cyrus had already met whatever fate the ledger had cryptically termed subject eliminated. But Coleman's face went pale. The corruption network that had protected him for decades suddenly looked fragile, vulnerable to exposure from multiple directions. Even if I let you walk out of here, Coleman said slowly, you'll destroy everything. Hundreds of families, entire towns built on that foundation. Good. Lydia's voice was fierce in the lantern light, her family's centuries of suffering giving her words a cutting edge. They were built on murder. They deserved to fall. Coleman raised his weapon with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. Then you die knowing you've destroyed innocent lives along with the guilty ones. But Porter had been counting on this moment of hesitation. Pull that trigger and you confirm everything in my confession. Let us go and maybe we can find a way to minimize the damage to innocent people. The sheriff's hand trembled on his weapon as he weighed his impossible options. Kill them and face certain exposure, or let them live and face probable destruction. The moment stretched out, measured in heartbeats, in rasping breaths that echoed in the ancient chamber. In that moment of uncertainty, Porter saw their only chance for survival. He had spent his entire adult life reading people, assessing threats, calculating risks. Coleman was a predator, but one who had grown fat and comfortable in his unchallenged position. He wasn't prepared for prey that fought back with intelligence rather than desperation. You've got 1 minute to decide, Porter said calmly. Either way, the truth comes out. The only question is whether you want to add 2 more murders to the charges. The sheriff's resolve finally cracked his weapon, lowering as he realized that decades of careful planning had been undone by his own arrogance. He had become so confident in his control that he'd failed to consider a victim who might actually fight back intelligently. Walk away, Coleman said through gritted teeth, but know that you've destroyed more lives than you've saved. Porter and Lydia backed toward a second tunnel exit that Emma Mercer's map had indicated, an escape route the original conspirators had never discovered. As they disappeared into the darkness, Coleman's curses echoed off the stone walls, but he made no move to pursue them. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time in 2 centuries, the conspiracy faced the one thing it couldn't control or eliminate: the truth. The escape tunnel narrowed as Porter and Lydia pushed deeper into the darkness, the sound of Coleman's rage fading behind them. Water seeped through limestone walls, creating slick patches that threatened their footing with each hurried step. The air grew thinner, carrying the musty scent of earth undisturbed for generations. Their flashlight beams cut weak paths through blackness that felt almost solid, revealing glimpses of boot prints in the mud, evidence they weren't the first to flee through this forgotten passage. The tunnel eventually angled upward, hope rising with each step toward the surface. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, Porter spotted a faint glow ahead. Starlight filtering through a canopy of vegetation that had grown across the exit. They emerged into the night air, gulping it gratefully after the stale confines of the underground chamber. The exit had deposited them in a densely wooded ravine, nearly a mile from where they'd entered the waterfall's roar, now just a distant murmur. Porter assessed their position against the stars, mentally mapping their location on the ranch property. We're on the far eastern edge, almost at the county line. Coleman won't expect us to have come this far. Lydia leaned against a pine trunk, exhaustion etching lines across her face that hadn't been there hours earlier. How did they know about the cave, about everything? This secret has been in my family for generations, and suddenly they're waiting for us. Porter's mind raced through possibilities, reconstructing the timeline. When we talked in the store, someone was watching, and the ledger entry about my ranch purchase. This was planned from the beginning. They've always known about the cave. They've been using it for 2 centuries. A distant engine sound froze them both. Headlights swept across the treetops as vehicles moved along the ridge road above them. Coleman hadn't given up. He'd simply changed tactics. We need to keep moving. Porter helped Lydia to her feet, supporting her as they navigated the steep terrain. The night forest concealed them, but also concealed potential dangers: deadfalls, ravines, and the men hunting them. He chose their path carefully, using his military training to minimize signs of their passage while maintaining a steady pace away from the approaching vehicles. The pursuit was methodical rather than frantic. Coleman's men swept the area in coordinated patterns, their lights systematically probing the darkness. These weren't ordinary deputies on a routine search. They moved like men accustomed to tracking prey that didn't want to be found. Porter guided Lydia into a hidden gully where a spring-fed stream had carved a narrow channel through the limestone. The water would mask their scent and footprints from any tracking dogs Coleman might deploy. The cold current numbed their feet as they waded upstream, using the overhanging banks for concealment. Above them, lights continued to sweep the forest, accompanied by the crackle of radio communications too distant to decipher. In the temporary shelter of a rock overhang, they paused to catch their breath. Water dripped from their soaked clothing, each drop a tiny percussion against the stone floor. The adrenaline that had carried them through the cave was ebbing, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and questions that couldn't wait until morning. Lydia wrung water from her hair, her hands trembling with cold and delayed shock. My family has lived with whispers and shame for generations. We knew something terrible happened, but this, a conspiracy spanning centuries. How many people have they killed to protect this secret? Porter removed his flannel shirt, relatively dry beneath his jacket, and draped it over Lydia's shoulders. His military career had shown him the darkest aspects of human nature, but this systematic corruption felt different, more insidious because it wore the mask of respectability, of law and order. I've seen what power does when it operates without accountability. The people who started this, they probably told themselves it was just one crime, just one man who needed to be silenced. But corruption never stays contained. It spreads, becomes institutional. The sons inherit not just the wealth, but the methods, the justifications. Lydia pulled the shirt tighter around herself, the oversized garment, making her seem smaller, more vulnerable. My grandfather used to say our family was cursed, that we'd done something to deserve our poverty, our outsider status. He drank himself to death, believing we were somehow at fault for our own suffering. All those years, no one in town would hire a Mercer for anything but the most menial work. No bank would give us loans. No school would hire us as teachers. They systematically destroyed every generation of my family. The raw pain in her voice struck Porter with physical force. His own history of standing against corruption suddenly seemed almost trivial in comparison. He had lost a career. The Mercers had lost 2 centuries of opportunity, dignity, and lives. I reported corruption in my unit in Afghanistan, watched my career get dismantled piece by piece for doing the right thing. But at least I had a choice. I saw something wrong and chose to speak up. Your family never even had that chance. The crime was committed against you, and then you were punished for being victims. A light rain began to fall, pattering against the leaves overhead. The forest sounds changed pitch, creating a natural symphony that might help mask their movements. Porter studied the darkness beyond their shelter, calculating risks and options. The ranch is probably watched. They'll expect us to return there or try to reach town. Our best move is the unexpected one. There's a fire watch tower on Bald Mountain about 4 miles northeast of here. It's automated now, no permanent staff, but it should have emergency supplies and a radio. We can call for help from outside the county. The trek through rain-soaked forest tested them both. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached Bald Mountain, forcing them to scramble up steep slopes, slick with wet pine needles and loose shale. Lydia matched Porter's pace without complaint, her determination visible in the set of her jaw and the focused intensity of her movements. This was a woman who had lived her entire life fighting invisible barriers. A 4-mile hike through hostile wilderness wouldn't break her. As first light seeped through the cloud cover, they reached the base of the fire watchtower. The metal structure rose 60 feet above the mountaintop, its observation deck offering a 360-degree view of Clearwater County and beyond. A chain-link fence surrounded the tower's base, but the gate hung open, a maintenance visit forgotten or interrupted. Porter scanned the surrounding forest before they approached. No vehicles were visible, no fresh tire tracks in the muddy access road. The tower appeared deserted, but appearances had proven deadly deceptive over the past 24 hours. The metal stairs rang hollowly as they climbed the sound carrying in the dawn stillness. Each landing offered an increasingly expansive view of the county, rolling forested hills giving way to pasture land and distant mountains shrouded in morning mist. From this height, the land looked pristine, unmarred by the human corruption that had seeped through its soil for generations. The observation deck was secured with a padlock, but Porter made quick work of it using techniques learned in less official aspects of his military training. Inside the small enclosure contained basic emergency equipment, first aid supplies, shelf-stable rations, water blankets, and most importantly, a solar-powered radio designed for emergency communications. Porter activated the radio while Lydia inventoried their resources. The tower's elevated position should provide clear transmission to services outside Coleman's jurisdiction. He tuned to the state police emergency frequency and identified himself, keeping the details minimal, but emphasizing the urgent need for intervention from authorities beyond the county level. The responding officer promised to relay the message, but Porter recognized the professional skepticism in the man's voice. Claims of multi-generational conspiracy and corrupt law enforcement sounded paranoid without the supporting evidence they'd left behind in the cave. Lydia spread the blankets on the observation deck's floor, creating a makeshift rest area. Now that they were temporarily safe, the physical and emotional toll of the night's events manifested in trembling hands and thousand-yard stares. They sat side by side, shoulders touching, finding comfort in proximity, while they assessed their situation. Porter unwrapped an emergency ration bar, breaking it in half to share. Sometimes in Afghanistan, we'd go into villages where the local authorities had been exploiting the population for generations. The fear was so ingrained that people couldn't imagine any other way to live. They mistrusted anyone who offered help because experience had taught them that change only made things worse. Lydia accepted the food with a grateful nod. That's Clearwater County. The founding families, they don't just control the economy and local government, they control the narrative. Anyone who questions things suddenly has tax problems, or their business loses customers, or their kids get harassed at school. People learn to look the other way because the alternative is becoming the next Mercer family. The morning sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the tower in golden light that belied the darkness they'd witnessed underground. Porter studied Lydia's face in this new clarity. The strength in her features, the intelligence in her eyes, the determination that generations of persecution hadn't managed to extinguish. Her family had endured 2 centuries of systematic oppression without surrendering their dignity or their truth. That kind of resilience was rarer and more valuable than any gold buried beneath the ranch. You never gave up. Your family kept the truth alive through 2 centuries of persecution. That's something most people couldn't do. Lydia's smile held more sadness than joy. We kept the story, but we lost so much else. My father died never knowing why his family was ostracized. My brother left at 18 and never came back, changed his name to escape the Mercer curse. I stayed because someone had to remember, but sometimes I wondered if I was just clinging to a ghost story. Porter's satellite phone chirped, a message from his encrypted cloud storage confirming that the photographs he'd taken of the historical documents had successfully uploaded. At least some evidence of the conspiracy had escaped Coleman's reach, preserved where local authorities couldn't delete or destroy it. The physical evidence is still in the cave. The gold, the bodies, the ledger. If we can get state or federal authorities to search there, Coleman can't cover it up. Lydia's expression darkened. You don't understand how this county works. Coleman is just the visible face. The Harrisons control the banks and half the businesses. The Wickhams have judges and prosecutors on both sides of the political aisle. The Bradfords own the largest construction company and have contracts throughout the state. They'll call in favors, make evidence disappear, discredit witnesses. They've been doing it for 200 years. The radio crackled to life before Porter could respond. The state police dispatcher requested their exact location, stating that officers had been dispatched to investigate their claims. The professional formality in the woman's voice should have been reassuring, but something in her tone raised Porter's combat-honed instincts. He provided intentionally vague coordinates, intuition warning against revealing their precise location. His caution proved prescient 30 minutes later when two unmarked vehicles approached the fire tower access road. Through the observation deck's binoculars, Porter recognized Coleman's personal truck, leading a county SUV with official markings. No state police cruisers, no external authorities, just Coleman and his men moving with purposeful efficiency toward the tower. They're coming. Porter gathered their meager supplies, shoving them into his backpack. We need to move before they surround us. The descent from the tower was far more treacherous than their climb had been. Each metal step rang with betraying resonance, announcing their position to the approaching search party. They were halfway down when the first shout came from below, followed by the distinctive sound of weapons being readied. Porter assessed their options with combat-forged clarity. The tower offered no viable defensive position. They would be trapped if they returned to the observation deck. Continuing downward meant certain capture. The only remaining option was so desperate it bordered on suicidal, but desperation had become their constant companion. The maintenance ladder. Porter pointed to a narrow metal ladder on the tower's far side leading to a thick power cable that stretched from the tower to a pole 50 yards away. The cable had been installed to provide electricity before the solar conversion, and while it was never intended as a transportation route, it might support their weight long enough to reach the tree line beyond Coleman's perimeter. Lydia assessed the rusted ladder and the dubious cable with a surveyor's eye. Her nod conveyed not confidence but acceptance of their limited choices. The ladder groaned under their weight as they crossed to the tower's far side, rust flakes showering down with each movement. Below, shouts indicated that Coleman's men had spotted their maneuver and were repositioning to cut off this unexpected escape route. Porter went first, testing each rung before committing his weight. The ladder ended at a small platform where the cable was anchored to the tower structure. The steel cable, nearly 2 inches thick, stretched across open air to the distant pole, a tightrope with nothing but a 60-foot drop between them and the rocky ground below. This was the moment where training overrode fear. Porter straddled the cable using his arms and legs to distribute weight and maintain balance. The metal was slick with morning dew, its cold surface biting into his palms as he began the painfully slow journey. Behind him, Lydia followed with surprising agility, her smaller frame requiring different techniques, but achieving the same precarious progress. A gunshot cracked the morning stillness, the bullet whining past Porter's head before embedding itself in the wooden pole ahead. Coleman was done with pretense. This was now a hunt with deadly intent. The shot had come from directly below the shooter, using the tower's central support column for cover while lining up his next attempt. Porter increased his pace, the cable swaying dangerously with each movement. His hands were numb muscles screaming from the unnatural position required to maintain balance. Another shot rang out, this one striking the cable itself, sending vibrations that nearly dislodged them both. 20 feet from safety, Porter heard the metallic groan of failing equipment. The cable's anchor point on the tower was pulling free, decades of weather and neglect having weakened its moorings. They had seconds, not minutes, before catastrophic failure. Porter lunged forward, abandoning caution for speed. The cable swung wildly with his movement, threatening to buck Lydia off as she struggled to maintain her position. The distance to the pole narrowed, 15 feet, 10-5. Each yard gained a victory against gravity and failing metal. The final anchor bolt sheared away just as Porter reached the pole, his momentum carrying him into its rough wooden surface with bruising force. He clung to the crossbeam, watching in horror as the cable separated from the tower, dropping toward the ground with Lydia still clinging to its length. What happened next defied both physics and probability. As the cable fell, its trajectory carried it in an arc that brought its end within reach of the pine trees bordering the clearing. Lydia, displaying the instinctive grace of someone whose body reacts before conscious thought can intervene, leapt from the falling cable into the nearest tree. her hands catching a branch that bent but held under her weight. Porter climbed down the pole, each movement a negotiation with gravity and his own exhausted muscles. Behind them, Coleman's men were circling the tower, weapons drawn, their shouts indicating the beginning of a coordinated search pattern. The dense forest offered temporary concealment, but they needed distance and direction to evade their pursuers. They fled deeper into the wilderness, using the morning sun to maintain a northeasterly heading away from Clearwater County. The terrain worked both for and against them. The rugged landscape slowed their progress, but also complicated the search efforts behind them. Porter set a sustainable pace, balancing the need for speed against the reality of their physical condition. They had escaped immediate danger, but remained hunted in territory controlled by their enemies. By mid-morning, they had reached a ridgeline that offered momentary respite and perspective. Below them, Clearwater County spread like a living map, its boundaries defined by natural features rather than political decisions. From this elevation, Porter could trace the path they had taken, from the ranch to the cave, from the cave to the tower, and now into wilderness that straddled county lines. "We're approaching federal land." Porter gestured toward the northern horizon where the terrain grew more rugged. "The national forest starts about 2 miles ahead. Different jurisdiction, different law enforcement. If we can reach it, Coleman loses his home field advantage." Lydia sank onto a fallen log, her reserves visibly depleted despite her determination. The past 24 hours had transformed her understanding of her family's history, upended her life in Clearwater, and now had her fleeing for her life through unfamiliar wilderness. Yet her voice remained steady, her focus undiminished. "We need evidence they can't ignore or bury. The photographs you uploaded are a start, but they'll claim the documents are forgeries or taken out of context. We need something current, something that proves the conspiracy continues today." Porter nodded, recalling the ledger entries that documented recent activities. The most compelling evidence remained in the cave: the physical bodies, the gold, the detailed records of 2 centuries of criminal enterprise. But that evidence was now inaccessible, guarded by the very men they needed to expose. Cyrus. Porter's mind latched onto the connection he had fabricated during their confrontation with Coleman. "I told Coleman that Cyrus had been documenting everything that he was hiding at my place. It was a bluff, but what if we could find him? He must know details about how they operate today. Who gives the orders, how the money flows, where the bodies are buried." Literally. The irony of his final word hung in the air between them. Bodies buried beneath Porter's ranch, bodies in the cave, and likely more bodies scattered across the county. The physical evidence of generations of silenced witnesses. But Cyrus might still be alive, might have escaped whatever elimination the conspiracy had planned for him. Lydia considered this possibility, her analytical mind visibly working through the implications. Cyrus was terrified when he sold you the ranch. Not just afraid, but broken somehow. If he's alive, he's hiding somewhere. He feels safe somewhere beyond Coleman's reach. Porter's tactical training engaged, considering options and angles. A man like Cyrus, local to the area but needing to disappear. Where would he go? Not far. He lacked resources for extended travel. Not to family, they would be the first place Coleman would look. Not to friends. Friendship was too dangerous in a county where loyalty was measured against self-preservation. When I lived in Kabul, people who needed to disappear often hid in plain sight, changed their appearance, took menial jobs beneath their station, became invisible through sheer ordinariness. Where could someone do that around here? Lydia's eyes widened with sudden realization. The lumber camp near Chester Ridge. It's seasonal work, cash payments, no questions asked. Dozens of men come and go throughout the season. Perfect cover for someone needing to disappear locally. The lumber camp represented hope, both for finding Cyrus and for evidence that might bring down the conspiracy. But reaching it meant traveling through another 15 miles of wilderness while evading Coleman's search parties. Porter studied their surroundings, calculating risks and resources. They had limited water, no food beyond emergency rations, and physical exhaustion working against them. But they also had determination bordering on desperation and the moral clarity that comes from fighting genuine evil. They continued northward, maintaining a careful balance between speed and stealth. Porter led them along game trails whenever possible, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted from the air. The forest thickened as they moved into less inhabited terrain, old-growth timber providing canopy cover that shielded them from potential aerial surveillance. By late afternoon, fatigue had become their primary adversary. Neither had slept in over 30 hours, and the physical demands of their journey had depleted reserves of energy and focus. Porter recognized the dangerous edge of exhaustion in Lydia's increasingly mechanical movements and his own slowed reaction times. They needed rest before attempting to infiltrate the lumber camp, but stopping meant vulnerability. A seasonal stream provided opportunity, its rocky bed leading to a small cascade that had undercut the surrounding bank, creating a natural shelter beneath the overhanging soil and tree roots. The space was cramped but defensible, visible only from directly in front and sheltered from the elements. Porter gathered spruce boughs to create primitive bedding while Lydia refilled their water bottles from the stream. The humble sanctuary offered their first genuine pause since discovering the skeleton on Porter's ranch. As afternoon shadow lengthened into evening gloom, they huddled in their narrow shelter, conserving body heat against the mountain chill. The physical proximity accelerated the emotional connection that had been forming through shared danger and revelation. They were strangers days ago. Now they were bound by secrets that could reshape an entire county's understanding of itself. We need to consider what happens if we succeed. Porter's voice was soft in the gathering darkness, but his words carried the weight of necessary foresight. If we expose the conspiracy, it doesn't just bring down Coleman and the current power structure. It undermines the foundation of the entire county. Businesses built on stolen land, fortunes accumulated through generations of fraud, families who never knew their wealth came from murder. The innocent will suffer alongside the guilty. Lydia's response came from a place of hard-earned wisdom. The innocent have been suffering for 2 centuries. My family, other families who got in their way. How many potential businesses never started because the founding families crushed any competition? How many young people left because there was no opportunity unless you were connected to the right names? The corruption didn't just hurt its direct victims, it stunted the entire community. Porter recognized the truth in her assessment. He had seen similar dynamics in war zones, how systemic corruption created ripple effects that touched everyone, even those who thought themselves removed from its influence. But he had also seen the chaos that followed when entrenched power structures collapsed without transition planning. I'm not saying we shouldn't expose them. I'm saying we need to be strategic about how we do it. If we dump everything at once, the shock could paralyze the county. Banks might fail if the Harrisons go down. Construction projects would stop if the Bradford contracts are invalidated. We need to find a way to excise the cancer without killing the patient. The metaphor hung between them as darkness completed its conquest of the forest. Neither spoke for several minutes, the gravity of their potential impact demanding respectful consideration. Eventually, Lydia shifted position, her voice carrying new resolve. My family lost everything because of them. Our reputation, our opportunities, our rightful place in the community. Some would say I should want maximum damage, make them all pay for what was done to us. But that's their way of thinking, not mine. I want justice, not vengeance. I want the truth acknowledged, not more suffering created. Her words resonated with Porter's own ethical framework, the belief in proportional justice that had guided his military career and ultimately led to his whistleblowing. Despite the personal cost, he had never regretted choosing truth over expediency. Now he and Lydia faced a similar moral calculation on a much larger scale. They agreed to take alternating watch shifts, though both knew their exhausted bodies would likely override this precaution. Porter took first watch sitting at the entrance to their shelter, while Lydia curled into the rough bedding behind him. Her breathing soon settled into the rhythm of deep sleep, her body claiming the rest it desperately needed. Porter maintained vigilance despite his own fatigue, scanning the darkening forest for any sign of pursuit. His mind replayed the events that had led them here, searching for patterns and vulnerabilities in the conspiracy they faced. The corruption had survived for generations because it adapted, evolving from frontier justice to modern financial and political manipulation. It remained hidden because those who discovered it were eliminated before they could spread the truth. But patterns that ensure survival can also create blindness. The conspiracy expected to control the narrative because they always had. They expected witnesses to be isolated because they controlled the channels of communication. They expected local authority to trump outside intervention because they had carefully cultivated relationships with regional power brokers. These expectations created potential weaknesses, assumptions that might prove fatal in an era of instant communication and digital evidence. Porter's uploaded photographs existed beyond Coleman's reach, accessible to authorities outside the conspiracy's influence. The physical evidence in the cave, while temporarily inaccessible, remained where no local cover-up could completely erase it. And Cyrus, if they found him alive, represented a witness whose testimony could bridge historical documents to current criminal activity. Dawn arrived with the gentle persistence that had greeted countless generations before their brief moment on this land. Porter woke Lydia as first light filtered through the forest canopy, her transition from sleep to alertness nearly instantaneous, the response of someone accustomed to maintaining vigilance even in repose. They broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal evidence of their presence before continuing their journey toward Chester Ridge. The national forest boundary provided psychological relief even without physical markers. Crossing into federal jurisdiction represented one more buffer between them and Coleman's authority. The lumber camp came into view by mid-morning, its collection of equipment, temporary structures, and stacked timber, creating an industrial island in the otherwise unbroken forest. From their observation point on a neighboring ridge, Porter could see workers moving with practiced efficiency between cutting areas and processing stations. Dozens of men, most indistinguishable at this distance, performing the physically demanding work of converting standing timber into commercial lumber. Finding Cyrus among them would require closer inspection and significant luck. They needed to approach without attracting undue attention. Two ragged, exhausted strangers would inevitably draw the kind of notice they couldn't afford if Coleman had extended his search this far. Porter surveyed the operation with tactical assessment. A water truck made regular circuits between the camp and a nearby spring following a dirt road that passed within 50 yards of their position. The driver appeared to be alone, focused more on navigating the rough terrain than on scanning for fugitives in the surrounding forest. When the truck approached on its next circuit, Porter timed their movement to coincide with a particularly rough section of road that demanded the driver's full attention. They crossed the open ground between forest and road in a controlled sprint, reaching the truck's blind spot just as it slowed to navigate a washout in the dirt track. Porter helped Lydia into the truck's rear storage compartment before climbing in himself, pulling the tarp closed behind them just as the vehicle accelerated toward the main camp. The space was cramped and smelled of diesel and dampness, but it offered concealment for the critical final approach to the lumber operation. The truck stopped several times as it completed its rounds, the driver unaware of his stowaways as he delivered water to various workstations. Each pause brought new sounds. Machinery shouted instructions, the rhythmic percussion of axes and saws. Porter tracked their progress, mentally building a map of the camp's layout based on auditory clues and the truck's movements. Their opportunity came when the truck stopped at what sounded like a central depot. The driver's door slammed, footsteps receded, and conversation drifted from what must have been a distance of at least 20 yards. Porter eased the tarp aside, confirming they were alone before helping Lydia from their hiding place. They emerged into organized chaos, the bustling heart of the lumber operation where workers loaded processed timber onto flatbed trucks for transport to distant mills. Men moved with focused intensity, their attention fixed on their dangerous tasks rather than on two strangers navigating the periphery of the work area. Porter led Lydia toward what appeared to be a mess tent, reasoning that all workers would cycle through this central location during the course of a shift. They skirted the main activity using stacked lumber as cover while observing the men for any sign of Cyrus. The challenge was substantial, but many workers wore similar clothing and protective gear, obscured facial features, and distance complicated identification. They needed proximity without exposure, information without inquiry. Lydia tugged Porter's sleeve, directing his attention to a solitary figure at the camp's edge. The man was splitting firewood for the mess tent stoves, his back to the main operation, hat pulled low over his face. Something in his posture, a distinctive stoop to the shoulders, a particular rhythm to his axe swings, caught Lydia's attention. "I think that's him. The build matches, and he's keeping his face hidden." Cyrus always had that left-handed swing when he'd come to the store for supplies. They approached cautiously, circling to approach from the forest rather than from the main camp. The man remained focused on his task, the repetitive motion of splitting wood creating a hypnotic rhythm that masked their approach until they were within conversational distance. Cyrus Yarrow. Porter kept his voice low, non-threatening, but the effect on the wood splitter was immediate and dramatic. The axe missed its target, embedding itself in the chopping block as the man spun to face them, Hera replacing surprise in an instant of recognition. "You can't be here." His voice emerged as a harsh whisper, eyes darting toward the main camp to check if anyone had noticed the exchange. "They'll kill all of us." Porter maintained a calm exterior, despite the confirmation that Cyrus was indeed a fugitive from the same forces that pursued them. "We know about the cave. We found the ledger. We've seen what they have been doing for 200 years. Color drained from Cyrus's weathered face, his expression shifting from fear to a strange mixture of resignation and relief. "You found it, and you're still alive. That's, that's not how it's supposed to work." Lydia stepped forward, her presence eliciting fresh shock from Cyrus. "A Mercer, with Barrow. They said you'd never, that the families never, they lied about everything." Lydia's voice carried 2 centuries of justified anger. "They murdered my ancestor and buried the truth along with his body. They've been murdering people ever since. We need your help to stop them." Cyrus's gaze darted between them, calculation visible behind his fear. He had survived by disappearing, by becoming invisible in plain sight. Now these strangers asked him to reverse that survival strategy, to become conspicuously visible in opposition to the forces that had driven him into hiding. "You don't understand what you're asking." His words emerged slowly, weighted with grim experience. "They're everywhere. Banks, courts, state offices. I reported them once. Went to the FBI with records of land fraud. The agent disappeared. 2 days later, my dog was poisoned. Message received." Porter recognized the broken spirit before him, a man who had glimpsed the true extent of the corruption and chosen survival over futile resistance. But circumstances had changed. The evidence was more substantial, the witnesses more numerous, and most importantly, the conspiracy had made a critical error in targeting Porter. "They made a mistake with me." Porter leaned closer, injecting steel into his voice. "I'm not from here. I don't have family they can threaten. I have military connections beyond their reach. And most importantly, I've already uploaded evidence to secure servers that will automatically release everything to state and federal authorities if anything happens to me." This final claim was partially true. The photographs existed in cloud storage, though without the automatic release mechanism Porter had implied. But the half-truth served its purpose, kindling a dangerous spark of hope in Cyrus's defeated eyes. "What do you need from me?" The question represented the first fragile thread of alliance, tentative but real. Porter wasted no time securing it before doubt could resurface. Evidence of current operations, names, dates, financial details, anything that connects the historical conspiracy to ongoing criminal activity. Anything that would compel federal authorities to investigate despite local resistance. Cyrus glanced toward the main camp, conflict evident in his expression. After a moment of internal struggle, he made his decision, commitment replacing hesitation. "Not here. Tonight. Cabin 3. After midnight, I have something that will blow the whole thing open. Recordings of meetings, financial transfers, explicit threats, everything." A shout from the main camp interrupted their conversation, not directed at them, but a reminder of their exposed position. Cyrus resumed his wood-splitting, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic thunk of the axe. "They're watching for you. Coleman has men in Chester and the ranger station at every road out of the county. They've been showing your pictures, calling you armed and dangerous. Be careful. Midnight, cabin 3. Porter and Lydia retreated into the forest before their presence could attract attention, finding concealment in a dense thicket that offered observation of the camp while providing defensive cover. The promise of concrete evidence had energized them both, but caution tempered their optimism. Cyrus had been broken once before. His courage might falter again when confronted with the reality of opposing the conspiracy directly. As daylight faded toward dusk, Porter constructed a rudimentary blind that would conceal them while offering multiple escape routes if discovered. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part, inactive hours that allowed doubt and fatigue to creep back into their consciousness. Lydia used the time to process the implications of their discoveries, her analytical mind mapping connections between historical crimes and present-day power structures. The conspiracy wasn't just about protecting ill-gotten wealth. It was about maintaining a system that ensured generational advantage for select families while suppressing competition and accountability. It's like they created an alternate reality, In the real world, crimes have consequences and markets have competition. In Clearwater County, they've constructed a closed system where normal rules don't apply. Anyone who threatens that system isn't just challenging individual criminals. They're threatening the entire artificial reality. Porter recognized the pattern from his military experience. We called it capture in geopolitics, when institutions designed to govern impartially are seized by private interests. It starts small: a judge who favors certain clients, a sheriff who enforces laws selectively. But over time, the exception becomes the rule. The institution no longer serves its stated purpose, it serves the captors. Night settled over the lumber camp, work lights illuminating continuing operations, even as most areas transitioned to skeleton crews. They watched as shifts changed, identifying Cabin 3 in the workers' residential area. A simple structure, identical to its neighbors, except for its position at the end of the row, slightly separated from the others. Hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Porter maintained vigilance while allowing Lydia brief periods of rest, her head occasionally nodding against his shoulder before jerking awake with instinctive alarm. The night sounds of she's machinery voices, the natural symphony of the forest, became background texture to their tense anticipation. At last, midnight approached. The camp had quieted significantly, with only security lights and occasional movement disturbing the darkness. Porter and Lydia emerged from their hiding place using the shadows between buildings to approach Cabin 3 without attracting attention from the night watchman making his rounds near the equipment yard. The cabin door opened before they reached it, Cyrus's silhouette briefly visible before he stepped aside to admit them. Inside, a single kerosene lamp provided minimal illumination, its flame adjusted to prevent light from escaping through the cabin's small windows. The space was spartanly furnished: a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, a footlocker containing presumably all of Cyrus's worldly possessions. He looked older than when Porter had first met him, the intervening months having carved new lines of worry into his face. But something had changed since their conversation that morning. A resolute set to his jaw, a steadiness in his gaze that suggested he had made peace with whatever consequences might follow his decision. Cyrus lifted the thin mattress from his bed frame, revealing a hollow space in the platform beneath. From this hiding place, he withdrew a weatherproof document case and a small digital recorder. His hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the table, not from fear, Porter realized, but from the enormity of the moment. These items represented his personal rebellion against forces that had terrified him into surrendering his ranch and identity. I worked for Bradford Construction for 20 years before buying my ranch. The recorder's voice activation captured conversations nobody knew I was preserving. Board meetings, planning sessions, explicit discussions of how to acquire properties they wanted, how to eliminate problems, how to maintain control. Names, dates, financial details, everything you asked for. He opened the document case, revealing neatly organized files, property records, bank statements, correspondence bearing official letterheads. But what caught Porter's attention was a hand-drawn map with detailed notations covering locations throughout Clearwater County. Burial sites. Cyrus tapped the map with a weathered finger. Not historical ones. Recent. People who discovered parts of the operation and had to be removed. Competitors who wouldn't sell. Journalists who asked too many questions. All marked with dates going back to the 1980s. I was supposed to add your name to this map, Barrow. That's why they had me sell you the ranch. You were chosen. The revelation confirmed Porter's suspicions, but still landed with physical impact. He had been selected, manipulated, positioned for elimination like pieces on a chessboard. Another victim in a centuries-long pattern of systematic murder and cover-up. Why me? What made me a target worth setting up so elaborately? Cyrus hesitated, uncomfortable with the answer he possessed. Your background, military intelligence, whistleblower history. They wanted to discredit you before eliminating you. Lydia's sharp intake of breath drew their attention. She had been examining bank statements while they talked, her finger tracing a pattern of transactions that apparently held significance beyond the obvious numbers. These accounts, they're not just local. There are international transfers, shell companies, property holdings in a dozen states. This isn't just about controlling Clearwater County. They're using it as a base for operations that extend far beyond local corruption. Porter examined the documents. Lydia indicated his intelligence training, allowing him to recognize sophisticated financial maneuvers designed to obscure ownership and evade regulatory oversight. The conspiracy hadn't merely continued for 2 centuries. It had evolved, adapted, expanded its reach while maintaining its original purpose, accumulating wealth and power through criminal means while presenting a facade of legitimate business and governance. The implications were staggering. What had begun as frontier justice perverted for personal gain had matured into a criminal enterprise, with tentacles extending into state politics, regional development, and international finance. Coleman was merely the visible enforcer of a system far more extensive than Porter had initially imagined. A sound outside the cabin froze all three of them mid-conversation, the distinctive crunch of boots on gravel moving with deliberate stealth rather than casual purpose. Cyrus extinguished the lamp in a single practice motion, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by moonlight filtering through small windows. Porter moved to the window with combat-honed silence, his body automatically positioning to minimize his silhouette while affording maximum visibility. What he saw confirmed their worst fears. Multiple figures converging on the cabin from different directions, their movements coordinated and purposeful. He recognized Sheriff Coleman's distinctive profile among them, the moonlight gleaming dully on the weapon in his hand. "They found us." Porter's whisper carried calmly despite the surge of adrenaline, preparing his body for fight or flight. "They must have followed us or been watching Cyrus." Cyrus responded with unexpected composure, the resignation in his voice suggesting he had anticipated this possibility. "There's a crawl space under the floorboards, access panel beneath the rug. Take the evidence and go. I'll buy you time." Porter recognized the offer for what it was, a sacrifice play from a man seeking redemption for his earlier surrender to fear. But acceptance would mean leaving Cyrus to almost certain death, a moral compromise Porter wasn't prepared to make. "We all go. No one gets left behind." Lydia had already located the access panel, lifting the corner of a threadbare rug to reveal a trapdoor barely large enough for an adult to squeeze through. She quickly transferred the documents and recorder into Porter's backpack, while he maintained surveillance on the approaching threat. The figures outside had established a perimeter cutting off conventional escape routes. Their methodical approach suggested confidence. They believed their quarry trapped and unaware, a tactical advantage Porter intended to reverse. "Cyrus, they'll expect you to be alone. When they enter, act surprised but cooperative. Delay them with conversation if possible. We'll circle around behind them once we're clear of the cabin." The older man nodded, determination replacing fear in his expression. Perhaps like Porter, he had grown tired of running from injustice. Sometimes the only path forward required turning to face what pursued you. Porter helped Lydia through the narrow opening, following immediately after, while Cyrus replaced the rug to conceal their escape route. The crawl space was claustrophobic, barely 18 inches between dirt floor and cabin understructure, thick with dust and cobwebs undisturbed for seasons. They moved by feel rather than sight, inching toward the cabin's rear, where a foundation vent offered potential egress. Above them, the cabin door splintered inward with unnecessary violence, a tactical choice meant to disorient and terrify the occupant. Boots thumped on wooden floorboards directly over their hidden position. Coleman's voice carried clearly through the thin floor. "Evening, Cyrus. Odd place for a man to hide who has so much explaining to do." Cyrus's response came with remarkable steadiness, his performance convincing despite the dire circumstances. "Sheriff, wasn't hiding, just working. Lumber camp doesn't care about a man's past as long as he puts in honest labor." The conversation continued as Porter worked the rusted screws securing the foundation vent, each twist requiring painful slowness to prevent betraying metal-on-metal sounds. Above them, Coleman's questioning grew increasingly pointed, his artificial patience wearing thin as Cyrus provided non-answers and deflections. The final screw surrendered just as Coleman's tone shifted from professional to threatening. Porter eased the vent cover aside, creating an opening barely adequate for human passage. He went first, ensuring the area beyond was clear, before helping Lydia squeeze through the narrow aperture. They emerged into moonlit forest 30 yards behind the cabin, the surrounding trees providing immediate concealment from any watchers positioned at the structure's front. Porter led them in a wide arc, circling to approach the cabin from an angle that would give them visual confirmation of the situation without exposing their position. From their vantage point, they could see Coleman's vehicles parked at discrete distances from the cabin, positioned for quick departure rather than clustered in an obvious raid formation. 5 men, including Coleman, had entered the structure, while 2 more maintained perimeter security, their attention focused outward for approaching threats rather than on the cabin itself. Porter assessed options with combat clarity. Direct confrontation was suicidal given the disparity in numbers and armament. Their advantage lay in mobility and the evidence now secured in his backpack, evidence that would remain valuable only if they survived to deliver it to appropriate authorities. A sudden commotion from the cabin interrupted his tactical planning. Raised voices, the crash of furniture, then a single gunshot that echoed through the quiet lumber camp. Porter instinctively moved toward the sound before conscious thought could intervene, his protective instincts overriding tactical caution. Lydia grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her voice urgent but controlled. "We can't help him now. The evidence is what matters. It's what he would want us to protect." The harsh truth of her assessment penetrated Porter's reactive impulse. Cyrus had made his choice, had perhaps been making it since the moment he sold his ranch for a silver dollar. The best honor they could pay him now was ensuring his sacrifice served its purpose. They retreated into deeper forest as lights came on throughout the lumber camp, the gunshot having roused workers from sleep. Behind them, Coleman would be manufacturing a plausible explanation. A fugitive resisting arrest, a tragic but necessary use of force by law enforcement. The official narrative would absolve the sheriff while eliminating another witness to the conspiracy's operations. The dark forest swallowed them as they pushed northward, their path illuminated only by starlight filtered through ancient trees. Each step carried them further from Clearwater County and its generational corruption, but also deeper into wilderness with limited resources and uncertain sanctuary. The evidence they carried represented power and danger in equal measure. The potential to expose a criminal enterprise spanning centuries, but also the reason that enterprise would pursue them with relentless determination. The weight of responsibility settled over Porter as he established their pace and direction. Cyrus's death demanded justice. Lydia's family history demanded vindication. And somewhere in Clearwater County, other victims of the conspiracy, past, present, and potential future, awaited the truth that might finally free them from systematic oppression. The burden was immense, but not unbearable when shared between them. Porter glanced at Lydia, moving steadily beside him, her determination undiminished by exhaustion and loss. In her, he recognized the same core quality that had driven his own whistleblowing, not merely courage, but the deeper conviction that truth ultimately mattered more than comfortable lies. They continued into the night, 2 figures dwarfed by wilderness and history, carrying evidence that could reshape both. Behind them, 2 centuries of buried secrets had begun their inexorable journey toward the light. The conspiracy had survived for generations by eliminating individual threats, but they had never faced the power of multiple truths emerging simultaneously. Historical documents, financial records, recorded conversations, and eyewitness testimony combining to form a case too substantial to dismiss or bury. For the first time in 200 years, the founding families of Clearwater County faced an enemy they couldn't easily eliminate. The truth itself finally unearthed from its shallow grave. Dawn broke reluctantly over the northern wilderness, pale light filtering through dense pine canopy to touch the exhausted figures huddled beneath a natural rock overhang. Porter and Lydia had pushed through the night until physical limits demanded rest, finding temporary shelter, where a granite outcropping created a defensible position with good sight lines of the surrounding forest. Now, as morning illuminated their sanctuary, the full weight of Cyrus's sacrifice settled over them, like the dew that clung to every surface. Porter studied the map from Cyrus's document case, tracing potential routes toward civilization uncontrolled by the conspiracy. They had crossed into federal land during the night, leaving Clearwater County's boundaries behind, but Coleman's influence likely extended beyond official jurisdictions. The nearest ranger station lay 15 miles northeast, a challenging hike through rugged terrain, but their best chance of contacting authorities beyond the conspiracy's reach. Lydia sorted through the evidence they had salvaged from Cyrus's cabin, organizing documents and examining the digital recorder with methodical precision despite her exhaustion. Her hands paused over a folder labeled Barrow Acquisition, her expression darkening as she scanned its contents. "They've been planning this for months. Your military background, your whistleblower history, it wasn't random. They identified you as someone likely to investigate if you found something suspicious. Then they deliberately placed you where you'd make discoveries, planning to discredit and eliminate you once you'd found enough to be dangerous. Porter absorbed this confirmation of Cyrus's earlier statement, the cold calculation behind his selection as a target, adding fresh dimensions to the conspiracy's methodical evil. They hadn't merely reacted to his discovery, they had engineered it, manipulating him with the same precision they had applied to victims across generations. My military training taught me that the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the most weapons, it's the one who thinks 3 moves ahead. The founding families have been playing this game for centuries, anticipating threats and neutralizing them before they fully materialize. Lydia closed the folder with decisive finality. But for the first time, they miscalculated. They expected you to be alone. They never imagined you connecting with me, never thought a Barrow and a Mercer would join forces. That blind spot created an opening we need to exploit. The digital recorder represented their most immediately valuable evidence. Porter activated it, and Coleman's distinctive voice filled their rocky shelter, the man's casual tone belying the monstrous content of his words. The Rawlins property is next. Environmental study found traces of gold in the creek bed. Standard protocol tax reassessment denied permits, apply pressure until they sell. If they resist, arrange an accident. Nothing dramatic. Brake lines on the mountain roads usually do the trick. The recording continued documenting weekly planning sessions where Coleman met with representatives of the founding families. Each gathering revealed new dimensions of the conspiracy's ongoing operations, property acquisitions disguised as legitimate business, strategic applications of regulatory pressure, and when necessary, calculated violence presented as unfortunate accidents or random crime. Most chilling were the methodical assessments of potential threats and their elimination. Porter's name appeared in multiple recordings, his background discussed with the dispassionate analysis of hunters evaluating prey. The conspiracy had identified his moral compass as both vulnerability and threat. He couldn't be bought, which made him unpredictable. But his history of whistleblowing made him potentially discreditable as a known troublemaker if evidence needed to be discounted. We need to get this to federal authorities. Porter powered down the recorder to conserve its battery. Not local FBI. Cyrus tried that route and it failed. We need multiple agencies simultaneously creating too many points of investigation for the conspiracy to block them all. They packed the evidence securely, distributing weight between their backpacks before breaking camp. The morning had advanced sunlight strengthening as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain, using natural features to maintain their northeastern heading. Porter set a sustainable pace despite urgency, recognizing that survival required balancing speed against endurance. The forest gradually changed character as they hiked old-growth timber, giving way to younger stands, punctuated by occasional clearings, evidence of past logging operations that had respected sustainable harvest practices, unlike the aggressive clear-cutting visible in parts of Clearwater County. Nature was reclaiming these human interventions, wildflowers and berry bushes thriving in sunlit gaps between regenerating trees. By midday, they reached a fire road, a maintained dirt track that would significantly ease their journey if it led in their desired direction. Porter consulted Cyrus's map, confirming the road eventually connected to the main Forestry Service network. The improved terrain allowed faster progress, but also increased exposure. They would be more visible to anyone searching the area. The calculated risk proved justified when late afternoon brought them within sight of the ranger station, a modest compound comprising a main building with radio antennas, several outbuildings for equipment storage, and staff housing set against the backdrop of the more rugged mountains beyond. A few official vehicles were visible in the parking area, along with a helicopter pad currently vacant but ready for emergency deployments. Porter studied the facility through his tactical lens, assessing approach angles and potential threats. The station appeared to be operating normally, no obvious signs of conspiracy presence or unusual activity. Nevertheless, caution dictated reconnaissance before direct contact. They observed from concealment as rangers went about routine duties, maintenance work on vehicles, radio communications, a small team returning from what appeared to be a backcountry patrol. The normality of the scene provided cautious reassurance, though Porter remained alert to subtle indications of compromise. Lydia broke the silence as sunset approached, the pragmatic edge in her voice reflecting decisions reached during their observation. We can't stay hidden forever. This evidence needs to reach authorities, and we need medical attention, food shelter. At some point, we have to trust someone. Porter nodded, his military experience having taught him that perfect security was an illusion. Every operation eventually required calculated risk. The conspiracy's power derived largely from isolation, from controlling who knew what within their sphere of influence. Breaking that isolation meant accepting vulnerability as the price of potential justice. They approached the station openly, hands visible, movements deliberately non-threatening. A ranger spotted them immediately, noting their disheveled appearance and apparent exhaustion with professional concern rather than suspicion. Porter recognized the distinction. This was a first responder seeing potential victims, not a conspirator identifying threats. "We need help." Porter kept his explanation simple, preserving details for appropriate authorities. "We have evidence of criminal activity in Clearwater County, including multiple homicides. Sheriff Coleman is involved. We need to contact federal authorities immediately." The station's senior ranger, a weathered woman named Daniels with 20 years of service, evident in her bearing, recognized the seriousness of their situation without requiring excessive elaboration. Her response was measured, professional, focused on immediate needs while establishing secure communications protocols. The process that followed demonstrated why the conspiracy had survived for generations despite occasional exposure. Local FBI declined direct involvement, citing jurisdictional procedure and suggesting they file reports with state authorities. State police expressed appropriate concern, but indicated any investigation would need to begin with county officials, the very people implicated in the crimes. Federal marshals showed more interest, but required authorization from offices currently closed for the weekend. Bureaucratic inertia threatened to delay action until Monday at earliest, potentially providing Coleman and his associates critical time to eliminate evidence and construct counter-narratives. Porter recognized the pattern from his whistleblowing experience. Systems designed to protect legitimate authority often inadvertently shielded corrupted power from accountability through procedural friction. Ranger Daniels proved unexpectedly valuable, her decades of service having built relationships that transcended organizational boundaries. Her call to a former colleague now serving with the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section bypassed conventional channels, connecting Porter directly with prosecutors specializing in corruption cases involving public officials. The conversation that followed marked their first significant breakthrough. The prosecutor listened without interruption as Porter outlined the conspiracy's historical origins and current operations, the systematic corruption of local government, and the evidence they had recovered from Cyrus's cabin. The official's response reflected both appropriate skepticism and recognition of the case's potential significance. "We need secure transportation to your office immediately." Porter emphasized the time-sensitive nature of their situation. "Coleman has resources tracking us, and this evidence needs protection. We have recordings, documents, maps of burial sites, everything required to build a case, but it's all vulnerable until properly secured." The prosecutor authorized emergency transport, recognizing that regardless of the allegations' ultimate validity, the safety of potential witnesses and preservation of evidence justified immediate action. Within 2 hours, a Justice Department helicopter landed at the ranger station's pad, its arrival representing tangible proof that the conspiracy's isolation had been breached. The flight to the federal building in Portland passed in exhausted silence, Porter and Lydia processing the jarring transition from wilderness survival to government protection. Below them, civilization reasserted itself. Highways and towns, farmland, and industrial areas, all part of a world where law still maintained at least theoretical primacy over corruption. Their arrival initiated protocols designed for high-profile corruption cases, secure rooms, evidence, handling procedures, medical evaluation, recorded statements. Porter recognized the professionalism in these measures, the systematic approach that distinguished legitimate authority from the conspiracy's self-serving power. The debriefing room projected institutional neutrality, functional furniture, recording equipment, the studied absence of personality. 2 prosecutors led the initial interview, their questions reflecting both necessary skepticism and growing recognition of the case's magnitude as evidence accumulated on the table between them. Porter and Lydia provided their accounts separately first, then jointly establishing independent verification of key events, while demonstrating how their separate experiences connected to form a coherent narrative. The digital recorder proved particularly compelling, Coleman's voice documenting crimes with casual authority that no fabrication could simulate. The financial records from Cyrus's cache revealed sophisticated money laundering operations, property acquisitions through shell companies, and strategic political donations that secured protective relationships with officials beyond Clearwater County. The conspiracy had evolved beyond its frontier origins into a modern criminal enterprise with connections throughout the region. Most disturbing was Cyrus's burial map, the documented disposal sites of inconvenient witnesses and obstacles spanning decades. Each marked location represented a life ended to protect the conspiracy's operations. A farmer who refused to sell strategically located land, a county clerk who questioned document irregularities, a journalist investigating unusual patterns in property transfers. Dawn was breaking again by the time the initial processing concluded 24 hours of security procedures and evidence documentation that transformed Porter and Lydia's desperate flight into the foundation of a federal case. The prosecutor's expressions had shifted from professional neutrality to focused determination as the scope of the conspiracy emerged from fragmentary evidence into documented reality. "We're securing federal warrants now." The lead prosecutor updated them as they finally received proper medical attention for the injuries sustained during their journey. "Based on your evidence, we're coordinating with multiple agencies for simultaneous action: FBI, Environmental Protection, IRS, Criminal Division. We can't risk piecemeal approaches that might allow evidence destruction." Porter recognized the strategy for military operations: overwhelming force applied at multiple points simultaneously, preventing effective resistance or strategic withdrawal. The conspiracy had survived for generations by eliminating isolated threats. It had never faced coordinated federal intervention across multiple jurisdictions and agencies. Sleep came suddenly and completely once basic security was established. Both Porter and Lydia surrendering to exhaustion in the protected hotel rooms arranged by the Justice Department. When Porter woke nearly 12 hours later, the operation was already underway. Simultaneous raids targeting Coleman's office, Harrison Financial Institutions, Wickham Legal Practices, and Bradford construction companies throughout the region. The scale of evidence recovered exceeded even the prosecutor's expectations. The cave beneath Porter's ranch yielded historical gold repositories alongside modern records of ongoing operations. Computers seized from conspiracy members contained databases tracking generations of criminal activity disguised as legitimate business. Most damning were the burial sites marked on Cyrus's map, each excavation revealing human remains corresponding to missing persons cases that local authorities had conspicuously failed to solve. Coleman himself was arrested while attempting to flee across state lines, his vehicle containing falsified identification documents and substantial cash reserves, suggesting long-term planning for potential exposure. Unlike his ancestors who had operated in an era when local power could effectively insulate criminal activity, the sheriff faced a justice system designed to handle precisely such corrupted authority. Other conspiracy members reacted according to individual temperament. Judge Harrison was found dead in his study, a single gunshot wound indicating his preference for traditional final judgment over modern judicial proceedings. Land Commissioner Bradford attempted to destroy records, but succeeded only in adding obstruction charges to his indictment. The Wickham family patriarch hired prominent attorneys and began negotiating potential cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Porter watched these developments from the insulated perspective of protected witness status, the Justice Department having established security protocols proportionate to the case's significance. The evidence he and Lydia had provided formed the foundation for what prosecutors were already describing as potentially the most significant public corruption case in state history. Beyond the criminal proceedings, wider repercussions spread through Clearwater County like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Banks controlled by conspiracy members faced regulatory intervention and possible failure. Construction projects halted amid questions about permitting processes and land acquisition methods. Property titles came under review, raising fundamental questions about ownership legitimacy extending back generations. The community's reaction displayed the complex psychology of populations emerging from systematic manipulation. Some residents expressed shock and betrayal, their belief in local institutions shattered by revelations of multi-generational corruption. Others demonstrated the stubborn denial characteristic of those whose worldview and self-image depended on maintaining certain fictions, about their community's fundamental decency. Most poignant were those who had long suspected something wrong beneath Clearwater's surface, but lacked the language or evidence to articulate their concerns. For these individuals, validation arrived alongside disillusionment, confirmation that their instinctive unease had been justified, coupled with recognition that institutions they should have been able to trust had been comprehensively corrupted. 3 days after the initial raids, Porter received an unexpected visitor in his secured hotel suite. The federal marshal who had been coordinating his protection detail arrived with a package that had been thoroughly examined before delivery, a worn leather journal wrapped in acid-free protective materials, its pages containing handwritten accounts spanning decades. It was found at Cyrus Yarrow's original property. The marshal provided context with professional efficiency, hidden in a compartment beneath the floorboards. Crime scene technicians almost missed it. The prosecutors thought you should see it immediately. The journal documented Cyrus's gradual discovery of the conspiracy, beginning with innocuous observations about unusual patterns in local business dealings and progressing to increasingly disturbing revelations about historical crimes and ongoing operations. Most significant was a separate section at the journal's end, apparently written during the months between selling his ranch to Porter and his death at the lumber camp. These final entries revealed Cyrus's strategic thinking. His decision to sell to Porter, specifically because of the former military officer's whistleblowing background, his careful placement of evidence, where an investigative mind would discover it, his orchestration of a revealing trail that would expose the conspiracy's operations. I chose Barrow because he already proved he would stand against corruption, regardless of personal cost. The final entry, dated just weeks before his death, revealed Cyrus's calculated gamble. I am leaving this record in case I don't survive. The evidence is placed. The trap is set. 200 years of murder and theft will end because one good man will not look away when confronted with evil. The revelation transformed Porter's understanding of his role in these events. He had not stumbled accidentally into the conspiracy's operations. He had been deliberately selected as the instrument of its exposure by a man who had studied his background and character, who had recognized in Porter the necessary combination of investigative skill and moral courage to follow the evidence wherever it led. Porter shared the journal with Lydia that evening, watching her reaction as she processed this new dimension of their journey. Her response reflected the same complex mixture of vindication and responsibility that Porter himself experienced, recognition that Cyrus had placed extraordinary faith in their abilities, coupled with renewed determination to justify that faith through the pursuit of justice. He saw something in you that I recognized immediately. Lydia closed the journal with careful reverence. Not just courage or intelligence, but a fundamental unwillingness to accept comfortable lies. He knew you would keep digging, even when it became dangerous. He bet his life on that quality. The responsibility inherent in this posthumous faith weighed heavily on Porter as federal prosecutors prepared him for grand jury testimony. The conspiracy's exposure had created both justice opportunities and collateral damage throughout Clearwater County. Innocent employees of corrupted businesses faced unemployment. Community services dependent on conspiracy-controlled tax revenue confronted potential collapse. Families with no direct involvement in criminal activity nevertheless faced loss of homes and livelihoods built on foundations they had never questioned. This uncomfortable reality informed Porter and Lydia's approach when prosecutors sought their input on case strategy. The Justice Department's institutional preference leaned toward maximum charges and public exposure, an approach that would certainly deliver satisfying justice against direct conspirators, but might devastate the wider community they had exploited. We need to be surgical. Porter advocated for targeted prosecution during a strategy session with the federal team. The people who knowingly participated in violence, fraud, and corruption deserve maximum consequences. But there are hundreds of innocent people in Clearwater County who never knew the true nature of the systems they depended on. Destroying their lives doesn't serve justice. Lydia supported this perspective with the moral authority of someone whose family had suffered generations of conspiracy-inflicted harm. My ancestors didn't die so we could create a new generation of victims. They died because they discovered truth and tried to share it. The truth shouldn't be weaponized to punish those who never had the opportunity to know it. This nuanced approach influenced the Justice Department's evolving strategy, creating a prosecution framework that distinguished between active conspirators deserving criminal penalties and unconscious beneficiaries requiring restorative rather than punitive measures. Land fraudulently acquired would be returned to rightful owners where possible, but with transitional provisions to minimize disruption to current occupants who had purchased properties in good faith. As the case proceeded through preliminary hearings, Porter and Lydia's protective isolation gradually relaxed, allowing cautious re-engagement with the community they had helped to upend. They returned to Clearwater County under federal protection, their presence generating complex responses ranging from gratitude to resentment, depending on how individual residents had been affected by the conspiracy's exposure. The ranch that had started their journey remained under federal control, its status as crime scene and evidence repository preventing immediate reoccupancy. Instead, Porter established temporary residence in a modest house at the county's edge, providing both security advantages and symbolic distance from the community's emotional center during its painful transformation. Lydia faced more complicated residential choices, her family history, making her simultaneous insider and outsider to Clearwater's social fabric. The general store where she had worked remained closed its ownership under investigation for connections to conspiracy operations. Her presence in town generated uncomfortable recognition. The vindicated pariah whose family's two-century disgrace had been dramatically reversed by recent revelations. 6 weeks after their return, as federal indictments formalized charges against surviving conspiracy members, Porter received a visitor he had anticipated but dreaded. Thomas Wickham Jr., son of the family patriarch now cooperating with prosecutors, arrived unannounced, his expensive vehicle incongruous outside Porter's modest rental. Unlike his father, the younger Wickham had not been directly implicated in criminal activity, though his career and status had certainly benefited from the family's corrupted wealth. "I grew up believing my family built something honorable." Wickham's voice carried genuine distress rather than the artificial outrage Porter had expected. "Every achievement, every advantage, I thought it came from hard work and business acumen. Now I learn it was all built on stolen land and murdered prospectors. My entire identity is based on a foundation of lies." Porter recognized the existential crisis inherent in this revelation. The psychological devastation that follows discovery that one's life narrative has been fundamentally false. He had seen similar responses in soldiers learning that missions they had risked their lives for were based on fabricated intelligence or corrupted objectives. The hardest thing isn't losing status or money. It's losing the story you told yourself about who you are and where you came from. But there's power in that loss too, the freedom to build something authentic once the comforting lies are cleared away. Wickham was merely the first of many community members seeking understanding, absolution, or simply human connection as they processed their imploded worldviews. Some approached Porter with gratitude for exposing long-suspected corruption, others with resentment for destroying the comfortable illusions that had structured their lives. All carried the disoriented expression of people whose fundamental assumptions about their community had been comprehensively invalidated. Lydia experienced similar encounters, though, with different emotional textures. For her, these interactions often involved implicit or explicit apology for generations of mistreatment, awkward acknowledgments from people whose families had participated in the Mercers' systematic ostracization. These conversations carried their own painful complexity, the humble recognition of historical wrong arriving simultaneously with the practical question of how individuals move forward from such profound social recalibration. The most significant community interaction occurred during a town hall meeting organized by federal authorities to address practical questions about Clearwater's future governance. The county courthouse, long the physical embodiment of corrupted authority, now hosted representatives from state and federal agencies outlining transitional processes for restoring legitimate local government. Porter and Lydia attended at the prosecutor's request, their presence considered important symbolic affirmation of the community's potential rehabilitation. The atmosphere vibrated with unresolved tension as residents confronted both past injustices and future uncertainties, their individual concerns aggregating into collective anxiety about whether Clearwater could survive its long overdue reckoning. A local teacher, elderly, respected, visibly distressed, posed the question that encapsulated the community's core fear. How do we build anything worthwhile knowing our entire history was poisoned from the beginning? Everything we thought made this place special was based on theft and murder. What foundation can we possibly build on now? The question hung in the charged air of the courthouse, its implications extending beyond practical governance into fundamental questions of community identity and moral rehabilitation. Federal officials equipped for administrative transition rather than existential guidance looked uncomfortably toward Porter and Lydia as those most directly connected to both the conspiracy's exposure and the community's pain. Lydia rose without prompting her quiet authority, silencing the murmured conversations that had followed the teacher's question. For 200 years, my family preserved the truth when everything around us demanded we accept comfortable lies. We lost property opportunity, respect everything except our integrity. That integrity is the foundation you were looking for. It was always here buried beneath the corruption, but never destroyed. Her words resonated through the courthouse, offering a perspective that federal authorities could not provide the lived experience of maintaining moral continuity through generations of systematic oppression. She was not an outsider imposing judgment, but the representative of Clearwater's alternative history, the counter-narrative that had persisted despite every effort to silence it. Porter followed Lydia's lead, adding his perspective as someone who had confronted institutional corruption in multiple contexts. The most dangerous lie about evil isn't that it doesn't exist. It's that once discovered, it can never be overcome. I've seen communities rebuild after discovering their leaders betrayed them. The reconstruction is painful, but creates something stronger because it's built on truth rather than convenience. The exchange marked a crucial inflection point in Clearwater's processing of its corrupted history. The questions that followed shifted gradually from recrimination toward reconstruction, practical inquiries about how legitimate governance might be established, how historical wrongs might be documented and acknowledged, how community identity might be reconstructed around more authentic foundations. As summer transitioned toward autumn, the legal proceedings against conspiracy members advanced toward inevitable conclusions. Coleman accepted a plea agreement exchanging reduced sentences for comprehensive testimony about conspiracy operations. Various Harrison family members received sentences ranging from decades of imprisonment for direct involvement in violence to financial penalties for knowing facilitation of fraudulent activities. The Bradford construction empire was dismantled through asset forfeiture and regulatory penalties. Most significant for Clearwater's collective healing was the federal court's ruling on historical properties acquired through conspiracy operations. Rather than wholesale dispossession of current residents, many generations removed from the original crimes, the court established a community trust to administer appropriate compensation to descendants of those whose land had been stolen, while allowing good faith purchasers to maintain their homes through reasonable settlements. The Eastern Ridge, where so many secrets had been buried, was declared a memorial site. Federal archaeologists working carefully to recover and identify remains from the multiple burial locations documented in Cyrus's records. Each victim received proper interment with whatever family identification was possible, the ceremonies attending these reburials offering a form of closure for both specific families and the community's collective conscience. The underground chamber where Porter and Lydia had confronted Coleman became a protected historical site, its contents preserved as evidence of both historical crimes and the community's commitment to acknowledging, rather than concealing, uncomfortable truths. School groups would eventually visit this location as part of educational programs designed to ensure future generations understood both the corruption that had shaped their community and the courage required to expose it. 6 months after their confrontation in the cave, as federal reconstruction efforts stabilized Clearwater's governance and economy, Porter received formal notification that his ranch property would soon be released from evidence status. The letter arrived as he was completing repairs on a small house at the edge of town, a property with historical connection to the Mercer family, identified through title research commissioned by federal authorities as part of their broader reconciliation efforts. The house wasn't grand or particularly valuable in conventional terms, but its symbolic significance transcended material worth. It represented tangible acknowledgement of historical wrong and commitment to practical restoration, the Mercer family's first legitimate property holding in Clearwater County after generations of systematic exclusion. Porter shared the letter with Lydia as they finished installing new windows in what would become her family home. Their relationship had evolved during Clearwater's painful transformation, deepening through shared purpose in complementary strengths. What had begun as alliance forged in survival necessity had matured into partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. What will you do with the ranch? Lydia paused in her work, the question extending beyond property management to broader considerations of Porter's future in a community still navigating its complex rebirth. Porter considered the question seriously, recognizing its implications beyond simple real estate decisions. The ranch represented both the conspiracy's attempt to manipulate him and his unwitting role in exposing generations of corruption. Its soil contained both agricultural potential and the buried evidence of historical crimes. Its ownership carried both opportunity and obligation. I'm thinking it should become something that serves the community's healing. Maybe a research center focused on rural governance ethics or educational programs about recognizing and resisting corruption. Something that acknowledges the past while building toward a better future. Lydia nodded, the implicit partnership in Porter's vision, requiring no explicit acknowledgement between them. Their shared journey through danger and revelation had created understanding that transcended conventional relationship development, a foundation of tested trust that made formal declarations almost redundant. The practical work of community reconstruction continued through changing seasons, federal oversight gradually transitioning toward local governance as new officials were vetted and elected through carefully monitored processes. Economic stabilization progressed unevenly but steadily with interim support, ensuring essential services continued, while corrupted systems were redesigned with appropriate transparency and accountability measures. Throughout this transition, Porter and Lydia maintained the careful balance between involvement and independence that their unique position required. As key witnesses in ongoing prosecutions, they remained somewhat separate from daily community operations. As moral touchstones for Clearwater's redemption narrative, they carried responsibility without formal authority, influential through example and experience rather than official position. The spring following their discovery of the conspiracy brought planning for a formal ceremony to dedicate the memorial cemetery on the Eastern Ridge. The event would mark a significant milestone in Clearwater's acknowledgement of its corrupted history and commitment to more ethical future governance. Federal officials, state representatives, and community leaders would participate alongside descendants of conspiracy victims in a public ceremony of remembrance and reconciliation. The day before this ceremony, Porter visited the memorial site alone, needing private reflection before the public observance. The Eastern Ridge had been transformed from secret burial ground to dignified cemetery, each recovered victim receiving proper headstone with name and dates where identification had been possible, simple markers noting unknown victim, where time had erased individual identity. The lightning-split oak still stood sentinel over this solemn ground, its divided trunk and blackened scar serving as nature's own monument to violent disruption and remarkable survival. Porter sat beneath its spreading canopy, contemplating the journey that had brought him from military whistleblower to rural rancher to key figure in exposing a two-century conspiracy. Footsteps on the cemetery's gravel path announced Lydia's arrival, her presence expected rather than surprising. They had developed the unconscious synchronicity of people whose experiences have aligned their internal rhythms, often finding themselves drawn to the same locations at similar times without explicit coordination. She settled beside him on the memorial bench, installed beneath the oak, her shoulder touching his in comfortable proximity. Together they surveyed the peaceful cemetery where justice had finally reached those who had waited generations for recognition and proper remembrance. Sometimes I wonder what Emma Mercer would think seeing justice finally delivered and after 200 years. Lydia's voice carried the weight of generational perspective, her connection to her ancestor, transcending conventional historical interest. That she died never knowing if her evidence would eventually find the right person, never seeing her husband's name cleared or her family's honor restored. Porter considered this historical reaching across centuries, the actions of individuals resonating far beyond their lifetimes in ways they could never fully anticipate. Emma hiding evidence beneath the oak, Cyrus orchestrating his elaborate revelation through Porter's purchase, each making decisions whose consequences would unfold decades or centuries after their deaths. Maybe that's the most profound kind of courage, planting seeds of truth, knowing you'll never live to see them grow. Acting on faith that eventually the right person will find what you've hidden, understand its significance, and have the courage to act on that understanding. The following day's ceremony brought together the various communities affected by the conspiracy's exposure, government officials responsible for reconstruction, descendants of victims receiving long-delayed acknowledgement, current residents navigating their community's transformed identity. The formal proceedings balanced necessary solemnity with cautious optimism, the memorial dedication serving simultaneously as acknowledgement of historical crimes and commitment to more ethical governance. Porter and Lydia attended not as featured speakers, but as witnesses to the community's potential rehabilitation. Their presence carried significance beyond any formal role, their journey from discovery to exposure, representing the essential transition from corrupted secrecy to transparent accountability that Clearwater now attempted on institutional scale. The ceremony concluded with individual residents placing white roses on the graves, this personal participation transforming abstract historical acknowledgement into intimate community responsibility. Porter watched as people whose families had benefited from the conspiracy's operations now honored those who had died resisting it, a symbolic reconciliation that offered potential foundation for authentic community reconstruction. As attendees gradually dispersed, Porter and Lydia remained at the memorial site, their private reflection contrasting with the public ceremony's necessary formality. The Eastern Ridge offered expansive views across Clearwater County, rolling pastures, forested hillsides, distant mountains, framing the landscape that had witnessed both terrible crimes and their eventual exposure. Lydia gestured towards this vista, her expression reflecting both inherited pain and cautious hope. For generations, my family could only see what had been taken from us. Now I'm trying to see what might be built instead, not forgetting the past, but not being imprisoned by it either. Porter nodded, understanding this delicate balance between remembrance and reconstruction. His military experience had shown him communities rebuilding after conflict, the complex process of acknowledging harm while creating space for healing. Clearwater faced similar challenges on different scale. The collective rehabilitation of a community, discovering its foundational narrative, had been comprehensively corrupted. The hardest transformation isn't physical reconstruction. It's rebuilding the story. A community tells about itself, creating a new narrative that acknowledges painful truths while offering genuine hope for something better. That's the real work that's just beginning. Here, 6 months later, as autumn painted the Eastern Ridge in amber and crimson, Porter stood at the altar of Clearwater's small church, watching Lydia approach in a simple white dress. Her bouquet contained wildflowers gathered from the memorial cemetery, symbolic connection to the ancestors whose perseverance had preserved truth through generations of systematic suppression. Their wedding represented personal commitment, but carried broader significance for the community still navigating its painful rebirth. Attendees included descendants of conspiracy victims alongside residents working to rebuild Clearwater's civic institutions on more ethical foundations, symbolic integration of historical acknowledgement and future possibility. As they exchanged vows, Porter reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. A forgotten ranch purchased for $1, a 200-year-old letter discovered in skeletal fingers, a desperate flight through wilderness, with evidence documenting generations of corruption. What had begun as transaction had revealed conspiracy. What had started as survival alliance had developed into partnership built on shared values and tested courage. The reception following their ceremony transformed the memorial cemetery into celebration space, this deliberate choice reflecting their commitment to integrating acknowledgement of past wrongs with creation of more ethical future. Tables set between gravestones might have seemed incongruous elsewhere, but in Clearwater's context represented appropriate recognition that healing required both solemn remembrance and community renewal. As evening approached, Porter found moment alone with Lydia near the lightning-split oak, its divided trunks silhouetted against the sunset. The ancient tree had witnessed the conspiracy's inception, preserved evidence of its operations, and now observed celebration of its exposure. Living witness spanning the complete arc from crime to justice across 2 centuries. Lydia leaned against his shoulder, her expression reflecting the complex mixture of vindication and responsibility that characterized their shared journey. My grandmother used to say that truth buried in darkness grows stronger, not weaker, that it develops roots that eventually break through any weight placed upon it. I never fully understood what she meant until now. Porter nodded, his military experience having taught similar lessons about the resilience of suppressed truth. In Afghanistan, we'd sometimes encounter villages where terrible things had happened years earlier, massacres or atrocities that everyone knew about, but nobody officially acknowledged. The silence created wounds that never healed. Only when the truth was finally spoken could genuine recovery begin. As darkness gathered and celebration continued around them, Porter surveyed the transformed community with cautious optimism. Clearwater would never return to innocent ignorance about its foundation, but perhaps could build something more valuable through acknowledgement and reconstruction, civic identity, based on confronting painful truth rather than perpetuating comfortable fiction. The ranch he had purchased for $1 had yielded treasure far more valuable than the gold hidden beneath its soil. Not material wealth, but the transformative power of truth, finally unearthed after generations of deliberate burial. The conspiracy had survived by eliminating individual threats while maintaining systemic corruption. Its exposure came not through single heroic action, but through collective courage and preserving evidence, Cyrus orchestrating its discovery, Porter and Lydia risking everything to bring it to light. As they rejoined their celebration, Porter reflected that perhaps this was the most important lesson from Clearwater's painful transformation. No corrupted system, regardless of its power or longevity, could forever withstand the cumulative courage of individuals committed to truth across generations. The founding families had maintained their conspiracy for 2 centuries through violence, intimidation, and systematic manipulation. Its exposure required equal persistence from those who recognized that some prices were too high for prosperity, that some foundations were too corrupt to support genuine community. The Eastern Ridge would forever stand as monument to both corruption's terrible cost and truth's remarkable resilience. The memorial cemetery acknowledging victims, while the lightning-split oak symbolized survival despite violent disruption. Porter and Lydia's shared future would develop alongside Clearwater's continuing rehabilitation, their personal commitment paralleling the community's gradual reconstruction on more authentic foundations. What had begun with a desperate man offering seemingly valuable property for token payment had revealed something far more precious than land or gold, the transformative power of truth finally unearthed from generations of deliberate concealment. Porter had bought a forgotten ranch for $1 and discovered not just physical evidence of historical crimes, but the profound moral lesson that truth, while easily buried, develops roots too powerful for any conspiracy to permanently contain.